2 Chronicles, chapter 1. Solomon son of David then made himself secure over his kingdom. Yahweh his God was with him, making him more and more powerful. Solomon then spoke to all Israel, to the commanders of thousands and of hundreds, to the judges and to every leader in all Israel, the heads of families. Solomon, and the whole assembly with him, then went to the high place at Gibeon, where God's tent of meeting was, which Moses, servant of God, had made in the desert. The ark of the covenant, however, David had brought from Kiriath-Jearim to the place which he had prepared for it, having pitched a tent for it in Jerusalem. The bronze altar which Bezalel son of Uri, son of Hur, had made was there, in front of Yahweh's dwelling, where Solomon and the assembly consulted him. There Solomon presented a burnt offering before Yahweh on the bronze altar of the tent of meeting, making on it 1,000 burnt offerings. That night God appeared to Solomon and said, "Ask what you would like me to give you." Solomon replied to God, "You showed most faithful love to David my father, and you have made me king in succession to him. Yahweh God, the promise you made to David my father has now been fulfilled, since you have made me king over a people as numerous as the dust of the earth. Therefore give me wisdom and knowledge to act as leader of this people. For how otherwise could such a great people as yours be governed? Since that is what you want," God said to Solomon, "since you have asked, not for riches, treasure, honor, the lives of your enemies, or even for a long life, but for wisdom and knowledge to govern my people of whom I have made you king, therefore wisdom and knowledge are granted you. I give you riches too, and treasure, and honor such as no king had before you and none will have after you." So Solomon came away from the high place at Gibeon, from the tent of meeting, to Jerusalem and reigned over Israel. Solomon then built up a force of chariots and cavalry. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horses. These he kept in the chariot towns and near the king at Jerusalem. In Jerusalem the king made silver and gold as common as stones, and cedar wood as plentiful as sycamore in the lowlands. Solomon's horses were imported from Musur and Cilicia. The king's dealers acquired them in Cilicia at the prevailing price. A chariot was imported from Egypt for 600 silver shekels, and a horse from Cilicia for 150. They also supplied the Hittite and Aramean kings, who all used them as middlemen. Solomon then gave the order to build a house for the name of Yahweh and a palace in which to reign. 2 Chronicles, chapter 2. And Solomon allocated 70,000 men to be porters and 80,000 to quarry in the hills and 3,600 overseers for them. And Solomon sent this message to Huram king of Tyre, "Do as you did for my father David when you sent him cedars for him to build himself a palace to live in. You see, I am building a house for the name of Yahweh my God, to acknowledge his holiness so that perfumed incense may be burnt before him, the loaves of permanent offering be perpetually laid out, and the burnt offerings be made morning and evening, on the Sabbaths, new moons, and solemn festivals of Yahweh our God, as prescribed to Israel forever. And the house which I am building must be large, for our God is greater than all gods. Even so, who would not find it an impossible task to build a house for him, when the heavens and the heavens of the heavens cannot contain him? And who am I to build a house for him except to burn incense before him? So now send me a man skilled at working in gold, silver, bronze, iron, scarlet, crimson and violet materials, and who knows the art of engraving too. He is to work with my skilled men in Judah and Jerusalem, whom my father David has provided. Also send me cedar, juniper and algum trunks from the Lebanon, for I know that your servants know the art of felling timber in the Lebanon. And my servants will work with your servants in preparing a vast quantity of timber for me, since the house which I intend to build is to be of a size to marvel at. Furthermore, for the upkeep of the woodcutters whom you employ to cut the timber, I shall provide 20,000 kor of wheat, 20,000 kor of barley, 20,000 bat of wine, and 20,000 bat of oil." In a letter sent to King Solomon, Huram king of Tyre replied, "Because Yahweh loves his people, he has made you their king." Huram went on to say, "Praise be Yahweh, God of Israel, who made heaven and earth and has given King David a wise son, endowed with discretion and discernment, to build a house for Yahweh and a palace in which to reign. I am now sending you a skilled and intelligent man, Huram-Abi the son of a Danite woman by a Tyrian father. He knows the arts of working in gold, silver, bronze, iron, stone, wood, scarlet, violet, fine linen and crimson materials, and is competent to carry out any kind of engraving and to execute any design which may be entrusted to him, in collaboration with your skilled men and those of my lord David, your father. So now let my lord send his servants the wheat, barley, oil and wine as promised, and we will fell all the wood you need from Lebanon, and bring it you in rafts by sea to Jaffa, and it will be your responsibility to transport it to Jerusalem. Solomon then took a census of all the aliens resident in Israel similar to the census which his father David had taken. It was found that there were 153,600. He impressed 70,000 of them as porters, 80,000 as quarrymen in the hills, and 3,600 as overseers to make sure the people worked. Second Chronicles, chapter 3. Solomon then began building the house of Yahweh in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, where David his father had had a vision, on the site which David had prepared, on the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. He began building it on the 2nd day of the 2nd month of the 4th year of his reign. These are the dimensions which Solomon fixed for the structure of the house of God. Its length in cubits, according to the old standard, was 60 cubits and its width 20 cubits. And the portico in front of the house was the full width of the house, that is, 20 cubits, and its height was 120 cubits. On the inside he overlaid it with pure gold. The great hall he lined with juniper, which he overlaid with fine gold and ornamented with palm trees and festoons. And he decorated the hall beautifully with precious stones and with gold from Parvaim, overlaying the hall, its beams and its thresholds, its walls and its doors, with gold, and engraving the walls with great winged creatures. He also made the Holy of Holies, the length of which corresponded to the width of the great hall, being 20 cubits, with a width of 20 cubits, and this he overlaid with fine gold weighing 600 talents, while the weight of the gold nails was 50 shekels. He also overlaid the upper rooms with gold. In the Holy of Holies he modeled 2 winged creatures of wrought metal work and overlaid them with gold. The total span of their wings was 20 cubits. One wing, being 5 cubits long, touched the wall of the house, and the other wing, being 5 cubits long, touched the wing of the other winged creature, while one wing of the other, 5 cubits long, touched the other wall of the house, and the other wing, 5 cubits long, touched the wing of the other winged creature. The spread of these creatures' wings was 20 cubits. They stood in an upright position, with their faces towards the hall. He also made the curtain of violet, scarlet, crimson, and fine linen, working a design of winged creatures on it. In front of the hall he made 2 pillars 35 cubits high, and on the top of each a capital measuring 5 cubits. He made festoons in the debir to go at the tops of the pillars, and made 100 pomegranates to go on the festoons. He erected the pillars in front of the temple, one on the right, the other on the left. The one on the right he called Jachin, and the one on the left, Boaz. Second Chronicles, chapter 4. He made a bronze altar, 20 cubits long, 20 cubits wide, and 10 cubits high. He made the sea of cast metal, 10 cubits from rim to rim, circular in shape and 5 cubits high. A cord 30 cubits long gave the measurement of its girth. Under it and completely encircling it were things like oxen, 10 to the cubit round the entire sea. The oxen were in 2 rows, of one and the same casting with the rest. It rested on 12 oxen, 3 facing north, 3 facing west, 3 facing south, 3 facing east. On these, their hindquarters all turned inwards, stood the sea. It was a hand's breadth in thickness, and its rim was shaped like the rim of a cup lily shaped. It could hold 3,000 bat. He made 10 basins, putting 5 on the right and 5 on the left, for washing in. The things to be offered as burnt offerings were to be rinsed in these, but the sea was for the priests to wash in. He made the 10 golden lampstands according to the pattern and placed them in the heikel, 5 on the right and 5 on the left. He made 10 tables which he set up in the heikel, 5 on the right and 5 on the left. He also made 100 golden sprinkling bowls. He made the court of the priests and the great court with its gates and plated the gates with bronze. The sea he placed on the right-hand side of the temple, to the southeast. Huram made the ash containers, the scoops and the sprinkling bowls. Thus Huram completed all the work done for King Solomon for the temple of God, the 2 pillars, the moldings of the capital surmounting the 2 pillars, the 2 sets of filigree to cover the 2 moldings of the capital surmounting the pillars, the 400 pomegranates for the 2 sets of filigree, 2 rows of pomegranates for each set of filigree, the 10 stands and the 10 basins on the stands, the 1 sea and the 12 oxen beneath it, the ash containers, scoops and forks. All these utensils made by Huram-Abi for King Solomon for the temple of Yahweh were of burnished bronze. The king made them by the process of sand casting, in the plain of the Jordan between Succos and Zereda. There was such an enormous quantity of them that the weight of the bronze could not be calculated. Solomon made all the objects designed for the temple of God, as well as the golden altar and the tables for the loaves of permanent offering, the lampstands with their lamps to burn, as prescribed, in front of the debir, of pure gold. The floral work, the lamps, the tongs of gold, and it was pure gold. The snuffers, the sprinkling bowls, incense ladles and the pans, of real gold, and the entrance to the temple, the inner doors for the Holy of Holies, and the doors of the temple itself, that is of the heikel, were also made of gold. Second Chronicles, chapter 5. Thus all the work done by Solomon for the temple of Yahweh was completed, and Solomon brought in the gifts which his father David had consecrated, and he had the silver, the gold and all the utensils put into the treasuries of the temple of God. Solomon then assembled the elders of Israel to Jerusalem, all the tribal chiefs, the princes of the families of Israel, to bring the ark of the covenant of Yahweh up from the city of David, that is, Zion. All the men of Israel assembled round the king at the time of the feast, that is, in the 7th month. When all the elders of Israel had arrived, the Levites took up the ark. They brought up the ark and the tent of meeting and all the sacred utensils which were in the tent. The Levitical priests brought them up. King Solomon and the whole assembly of Israel present with him before the ark sacrificed countless, innumerable sheep and oxen. The priests brought the ark of the covenant of Yahweh to its place, in the debir of the temple, that is, in the Holy of Holies, under the wings of the winged creatures. For they spread their wings over the place where the ark stood, forming a canopy over the ark and its shafts. The shafts were so long, however, that the ends of the shafts of the ark could be seen in front of the holy place in front of the debir, though they could not be seen from outside. They are still there today. There was nothing in the ark except the 2 tablets which Moses had placed in it at Horeb, when Yahweh made a covenant with the Israelites when they came out of Egypt. Now when the priests came out of the holy place, for all the priests present had sanctified themselves regardless of the orders to which they belonged, and all the Levitical singers, Asaph, Heman and Jeduthun with their sons and brothers, dressed in linen, were standing to the east of the altar with cymbals, lyres and harps, and with them 120 priests blowing the trumpets. And the harmony between trumpeters and singers was such that only one melody could be heard as they praised and gave thanks to Yahweh, and the singing began, to the accompaniment of trumpets, cymbals and musical instruments, and they praised Yahweh, for his faithful love is everlasting. Then the temple was filled with the cloud of the glory of Yahweh, and because of the cloud the priests could not stay and perform their duties. For the glory of Yahweh filled the temple of God. Second Chronicles, chapter 6. Then Solomon said, Yahweh has chosen to dwell in thick cloud, and I have built you a princely dwelling, a residence for you forever. Then the king turned round and blessed the whole assembly of Israel, while the whole assembly of Israel stood. He said, Blessed be Yahweh, God of Israel, who has carried out by his hand what he promised verbally to my father David, when he said, "From the day I brought my people out of Egypt I chose no city, in any of the tribes of Israel, to have a temple built where my name should be, nor did I choose anyone to be prince of my people Israel. But I did choose Jerusalem for my name to be there, and I did choose David to rule my people Israel." My father David had set his heart on building a temple for the name of Yahweh, God of Israel. But Yahweh said to my father David, "You have set your heart on building a temple for my name, and in this you have done well. And yet, you are not the man to build the temple, but your son, yet to be born to you, will be the one to build the temple for my name." Yahweh has kept the promise which he made. I have succeeded my father David and am seated on the throne of Israel, as Yahweh promised. I have built the temple for the name of Yahweh, God of Israel, and I have placed in it the ark containing the covenant of Yahweh, which he made with the Israelites. Then in the presence of the whole assembly of Israel, he stood facing the altar of Yahweh and stretched out his hands, for Solomon had made a bronze platform, 5 cubits long, 5 cubits wide and 5 cubits high, which he had placed in the middle of the court and on which he was standing. He knelt down in front of the whole assembly of Israel, stretched out his hands to heaven, and said, "Yahweh, God of Israel, there is no God like you in heaven or on earth. You who are loyal to the covenant, and show faithful love to your servants as long as they walk wholeheartedly in your way. You have kept it with your servant, my father David, as you promised him you would. What you promised verbally today you have carried out by your hand. And now, Yahweh, God of Israel, keep the promise which you made to your servant David when you said, 'You will never lack for a man to sit in my presence before me on the throne of Israel, provided that your sons are careful how they behave, following my law as you yourself have done.' So now, God of Israel, let the words come true which you spoke to your servant, my father David. Yet will God really live with the people on earth? Why, the heavens and the heavens of the heavens cannot contain you. How much less this temple built by me? Even so, listen favorably to the prayer and entreaty of your servant, Yahweh my God. Listen to the cry and to the prayer which your servant makes to you. Day and night, may your eyes watch over this temple, over this place in which you have promised to put your name. Listen to the prayer which your servant offers in this place. Listen to the entreaties of your servant and of your people Israel. Whenever they pray in this place, listen from the place where you reside in heaven, and when you hear, forgive. If someone has wronged his neighbor and a curse is laid on him to make him swear here before your altar in this temple, then listen from heaven and do justice between your servants, paying back the guilty one by making him suffer for his conduct, and acquitting the upright by rewarding him as his uprightness deserves. If your people Israel are defeated by the enemy because they have sinned against you, but then return to you and acknowledge your name, and pray and seek your favor in this temple, then listen from heaven. Forgive the sin of your people Israel, and bring them back to the country which you gave to them and their ancestors. When the heavens are shut and there is no rain because they have sinned against you, if they pray in this place and praise your name and, having been humbled by you, desist from their sin, then listen from heaven and forgive the sin of your servant and of your people Israel. For you are constantly showing them the good way which they must follow, and send rain on your country, which you have given to your people as their heritage. Should there be famine in the country, or pestilence, wind blast or mildew, locust or caterpillar, should their enemy lay siege to their territory, should there be any plague or any disease, whatever be the prayer or entreaty of any individual, or of all your people Israel, each being aware of his own affliction and pain, when he stretches out his hands towards this temple, then listen from heaven where you reside. Forgive and, since you know what is in his heart, deal with each as his conduct deserves, for you alone know what is in the human heart, so that they may revere you by following your directions, which you gave to our ancestors, throughout their lives on earth. Even the foreigner, not belonging to your people Israel but coming from a distant country, attracted by your great name, your mighty hand and outstretched arm, if he comes and prays in this temple, then listen from heaven where you reside, and grant all that the foreigner asks of you, so that all the peoples of the earth may acknowledge your name and, like your people Israel, revere you, and know that this temple, which I have built, bears your name. If your people go out to war against their enemies, on whatever mission you send them, and they pray to you, turning towards this city which you have chosen and towards the temple which I have built for your name, then listen from heaven to their prayer and their entreaty, and uphold their cause. When they sin against you, for there is no one who does not sin, and you are angry with them and abandon them to the enemy, and their captors carry them off to a country, be it far away or near, if they come to their senses in the country to which they have been taken as captives and pray to you once again in the country of their captivity, saying, We have sinned, we have acted wrongly and wickedly, and turn back to you with all their heart and soul in the country of their captivity too, which they have been carried away as captives, and pray, turning towards the country which you gave to their ancestors, towards the city you have chosen, and towards the temple which I have built for your name, then listen from heaven where you reside, hear their prayer and entreaties, uphold their cause and forgive your people for having sinned against you. Now, O my God, may your eyes be open and your ears attentive to prayer offered in this place. And now, Yahweh God, go up to your resting place, you and your fortress, the ark. Let your priests, Yahweh God, be robed in salvation. Let your faithful rejoice in what is good. Yahweh God, do not rebuff your anointed. Remember the faithful love of your servant David. Second Chronicles, chapter 7. When Solomon had finished his prayer, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices, and the glory of Yahweh filled the temple. The priests could not enter the temple of Yahweh, because the glory of Yahweh filled the temple of Yahweh. When all the Israelites saw the fire come down and the glory of Yahweh resting on the temple, they bowed down on the pavement with their faces to the earth, worshiping and praising Yahweh with, For he is good, for his faithful love lasts forever. Then the king and all the people offered sacrifices before Yahweh. King Solomon offered a sacrifice of 22,000 oxen and 120,000 sheep, and thus the king and all the people dedicated the temple of God. The priests stood in their places, as did the Levites with Yahweh's musical instruments which King David had provided, to render, Give thanks to Yahweh, for his faithful love lasts forever, whenever David offered praise to their accompaniment. Opposite them, the priests blew trumpets, while all Israel stood. Solomon also consecrated the middle part of the court in front of the temple of Yahweh, for that was where he presented the burnt offerings and the fatty parts of the communion sacrifices, since the bronze altar which Solomon had made could not hold the burnt offering, the oblation, and the fatty parts. And then Solomon and with him all Israel from the pass of Hamath to the torrent of Egypt, a very great assembly, celebrated the feast for 7 days. On the 8th day they held the assembly, for they had devoted 7 days to the dedication of the altar and 7 days to the feast. On the 23rd day of the 7th month Solomon dismissed the people to their homes, rejoicing and happy of heart over the goodness which Yahweh had shown to David, to Solomon and to his people Israel. Thus Solomon finished the temple of Yahweh and the royal palace, and he successfully concluded everything that he was of a mind to do in the temple of Yahweh and in his own palace. Then Yahweh appeared to Solomon in the night and said, I have heard your prayer and have chosen this place for myself as a house of sacrifice. If I shut the heavens so that there is no rain, or if I command the locusts to devour the country, or if I send pestilence among my people, if my people who bear my name humble themselves, and pray and seek my presence and turn from their wicked ways, then I will listen from heaven and forgive their sins and restore their country. Now and for the future my eyes are open and my ears attentive to prayer offered in this place. For now I have chosen and consecrated this temple, for my name to be there forever. My eyes and my heart will constantly be there. And if, for your part, you walk before me as your father David did, and do everything that I have commanded you to do, and keep my laws and my ordinances, I shall make your royal throne secure, as I covenanted with your father David when I said, You will never lack for a male to rule in Israel. But if you turn away and forsake my laws and commandments which I have laid down for you, and go and serve other gods and worship them, then I shall uproot them from the country which I have given them, and shall disown this temple which I have consecrated for my name, and make it a proverb and a byword among all the peoples. And at this once exalted temple, everyone who passes by will be appalled, and will say, Why has Yahweh treated this country and this temple like this? And the answer will be, because they deserted Yahweh, the God of their ancestors, who brought them out of Egypt, and adopted other gods and worshipped and served them. That is why he has brought all these disasters on them. 2 Chronicles, chapter 8. At the end of the 20 years which it took Solomon to build the temple of Yahweh in his own palace, and to rebuild the towns which Huram had given him and settle them with Israelites, Solomon mounted an expedition against Hamath-zobah and captured it. He also fortified Tadmor in the desert and all the storage towns which he had built in Hamath. He also built Upper Beth-horon and Lower Beth-horon as fortified towns with walls and gates and bars, also Baalath and all Solomon's storage towns, all the towns for his chariots and horses, and everything which Solomon was pleased to build in Jerusalem, in the Lebanon and throughout the territory under his rule. All those who survived of the Hittite, Amorite, Perizzite, Hivite and Jebusite peoples, who did not belong to Israel, those of their descendants still remaining in the country, whom the Israelites had not exterminated, these Solomon levied for forced labor, as is still the case today. Solomon did not, however, impose forced labor on the Israelites for his work, for they were soldiers, his senior officers and his chariot and cavalry commanders. There were 250 of King Solomon's officials in charge of the foremen who supervised the people. Solomon moved Pharaoh's daughter up from the city of David to the palace which he had built for her. "I must not be responsible," he said, "for a woman living in the palace of David king of Israel, for these buildings to which the ark of Yahweh has come are sacred." Thereafter, Solomon made burnt offerings to Yahweh on the altar of Yahweh which he had built in front of the portico, in accordance with the regular prescriptions for burnt sacrifices commanded by Moses, on the Sabbaths, new moons and the 3 annual feasts, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Weeks and the Feast of Shelters. Following the prescriptions of his father David, he assigned the orders of priests to their duties and the Levites to their tasks of praise and of assisting the priests in accordance with day-to-day requirements, as also the gatekeepers in their various orders to each gate, for Cush was the command of David, man of God. Nor was there deviation on any point from the king's command as regards the priests, the Levites, or even the storehouses. Thus, all the work was over which Solomon had put in hand when the temple of Yahweh was founded until it was finished. The temple of Yahweh was complete in every detail. Solomon then mounted an expedition to Ezion-Geber and Elath on the seacoast of Edom. Huram sent him ships through his agents, as well as experienced sailors, who went to Ophir with men in Solomon's service, where they took on 450 talents of gold, which they brought back to King Solomon. Second Chronicles, chapter 9. The Queen of Sheba heard of Solomon's fame and came to Jerusalem to test Solomon with difficult questions, with a very large retinue with camels laden with spices and an immense quantity of gold and precious stones. Having reached Solomon, she discussed everything that she had in mind with him, and Solomon had an answer for all her questions. Not one of them was too obscure for Solomon to answer for her. When the Queen of Sheba saw how wise Solomon was, the palace which he had built, the food at his table, the accommodation for his officials, the organization of his staff and the way they were dressed, his cupbearers and the way they were dressed, and the burnt offerings, which he made in the temple of Yahweh, it left her breathless, and she said to the king, "The report I heard in my own country about you and about your wisdom in handling your affairs was true, then. Until I came and saw for myself, I did not believe the reports, but clearly I was told less than half about the true extent of your wisdom. You surpass what was reported to me. How fortunate your people are! How fortunate your courtiers, continually in attendance on you and listening to your wisdom. Blessed be Yahweh your God. Because your God loved Israel and meant to keep it secure forever, he has made you its king to administer law and justice." And she presented the king with 120 talents of gold and great quantities of spices and precious stones. There never were such spices as those which the Queen of Sheba gave to King Solomon. Similarly, the men employed by Huram and the men employed by Solomon, who brought the gold from Ophir, also brought back algum wood and precious stones. Of the algum wood the king made steps for the temple of Yahweh and for the royal palace, and harps and lyres for the musicians, the like of which had never before been seen in Judah. And King Solomon, in his turn, presented the queen of Sheba with everything that she expressed a wish for, besides what he gave her in exchange for what she had brought to the king. After which, she went home to her own country, she and her servants. The weight of the gold received annually by Solomon amounted to 666 talents of gold, besides what tolls and foreign trade brought in. All the Arab kings and the provincial governors also brought gold and silver to Solomon. King Solomon made 200 great shields of beaten gold, 600 shekels of beaten gold going into one shield. Also 300 small shields of beaten gold, 300 shekels of gold going into one shield, and the king put these into the house of the forest of Lebanon. The king also made a great ivory throne which he overlaid with refined gold. The throne had 6 steps with a golden footrest attached to the throne, and arms on each side of the seat and 2 lions standing beside the arms, and 12 lions stood on either side of the 6 steps. Nothing like it had ever been made in any other kingdom. All King Solomon's drinking vessels were of gold, and all the plate in the house of the forest of Lebanon was of pure gold. Silver was little thought of in Solomon's days, since the king's ships went to Tarshish with Huram's employees, and once every 3 years the merchantmen would come back laden with gold and silver, ivory, apes and baboons. For riches and for wisdom, King Solomon surpassed all kings on earth, and all the kings in the world consulted Solomon to hear the wisdom which God had implanted in his heart, and everyone would bring a present with him. Objects of silver and of gold, robes, armor, spices, horses and mules, and this went on year after year. Solomon also had 4,000 stalls for horses and chariots, and 12,000 cavalrymen. These he stationed in the chariot towns and near the king in Jerusalem. He was overlord of all the kings from the river to the territory of the Philistines and the Egyptian border. In Jerusalem the king made silver as common as stones, and cedar wood as plentiful as sycamore in the lowlands. Horses were imported for Solomon from Musar and all the other countries too. The rest of the history of Solomon, from first to last, is this not all written down in the records of Nathan the prophet, in the prophecy of Ahijah of Shiloh, and in the vision of Iddo the seer concerning Jeroboam son of Nebat? Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel for 40 years. When Solomon fell asleep with his ancestors, he was buried in the city of his father David. Rehoboam his son succeeded him. Second Chronicles, chapter 10. Rehoboam then went to Shechem, all Israel having come to Shechem to proclaim him king. As soon as Jeroboam son of Nebat heard the news, he was in Egypt, where he had taken refuge from King Solomon. He returned from Egypt. They now sent for him. So Jeroboam and all Israel came and spoke as follows to Rehoboam: Your father laid a cruel yoke on us. If you will lighten your father's cruel slavery, that heavy yoke which he imposed on us, we are willing to serve you. He said to them, Come back to me in 3 days' time. And the people went away. King Rehoboam then consulted the elders, who had been in attendance on his father Solomon while he was alive, and said, How do you advise me to answer this people? They replied, If you are fair to these people, pleasant to them and give them a fair reply, they will remain your servants forever. But he rejected the advice given him by the elders and consulted the young men in attendance on him, who had grown up with him. He said, How do you advise us to answer these people who have been saying, Lighten the yoke which your father imposed on us? The young men who had grown up with him replied, This is the way to answer the people who have been saying, Your father made our yoke heavy, you must lighten it for us. This is the right thing to say to them, My little finger is thicker than my father's loins. Although my father laid a heavy yoke on you, I shall make it heavier still. My father controlled you with a whip, but I shall apply a spiked lash. On the 3rd day, Jeroboam and all the people came to Rehoboam in obedience to the king's instructions. Come back to me in 3 days' time. And the king gave them a harsh answer. King Rehoboam, rejecting the advice of the elders, spoke to them as the young men had recommended. My father made your yoke heavy, but I shall add to it. My father controlled you with a whip, but I shall apply a spiked lash. Thus the king refused to listen to the people, and this was brought about by God, so that Yahweh might fulfill the promise which he had made through Ahijah of Shiloh to Jeroboam son of Nebat. When all Israel saw that the king refused to listen to them, the people answered the king thus, What share have we in David? No heritage in the son of Jesse. Each of you to your tents, Israel. Now look to your own house, David. So Israel went home again. Rehoboam, however, reigned over those Israelites who lived in the towns of Judah. When King Rehoboam sent a ram who was in charge of forced labor, the Israelites stoned him to death, while King Rehoboam managed to mount his chariot and escape to Jerusalem. And Israel has remained in rebellion against the house of David from that day to this. Second Chronicles, chapter 11. When Rehoboam reached Jerusalem, he mustered 180,000 picked warriors of the house of Judah and Benjamin to fight Israel and win back the kingdom for Rehoboam. But the word of Yahweh came to Shemaiah, man of God, Say this to Rehoboam son of Solomon, king of Judah, and to all Israel in Judah and Benjamin. Yahweh says this, Do not go and make war on your brothers. Let everyone go home, for this is my doing. They obeyed Yahweh's command and went back instead of marching against Jeroboam. Rehoboam, residing in Jerusalem, fortified a number of towns for the defense of Judah. He built Bethlehem, Etam, Tekoa, Bethzur, Soko, Adullam, Gath, Mareshah, Ziph, Adoraim, Lachish, Azekah, Zorah, Aijalon, Hebron, these being the fortified towns in Judah and Benjamin. He equipped these fortresses, stationing commanders in them, with supplies of food, oil and wine, and shields and spears in each of these towns, making them extremely strong and thus retaining control of Judah and Benjamin. The priests and the Levites from all over Israel left their districts to put themselves at his disposal. The Levites indeed abandoned their pasture lands and their holdings and came to Judah and Jerusalem because Jeroboam and his sons had excluded them from the priesthood of Yahweh. Jeroboam had appointed his own priests for the high places dedicated to the satyrs and calves which he had made. And those members of all the tribes of Israel who were determined to seek Yahweh, God of Israel, followed those priests and Levites to Jerusalem to sacrifice to Yahweh, God of their ancestors. These added strength to the kingdom of Judah and gave their support to Rehoboam son of Solomon for 3 years. For 3 years they remained loyal to David and Solomon. Rehoboam married Mahalath daughter of Jerimoth, son of David, and of Abihail daughter of Eliab son of Jesse, and she bore him sons, Jush, Shemariah, and Zaim. After her, he married Maacah daughter of Absalom, who bore him Abijah, Attai, Ziza, and Shelemith. Rehoboam loved Maacah daughter of Absalom more than all his other wives and concubines. He had in fact a total of 18 wives and 60 concubines, and fathered 28 sons and 60 daughters. Rehoboam named Abijah son of Maacah as head, hence leader, of his brothers, with a view to making him king, and acted wisely by distributing his sons throughout the territories of Judah and Benjamin, some in each fortified town, where he provided plenty of food for them and found them wives. Second Chronicles, chapter 12. When Rehoboam had consolidated the kingdom and become strong, he, and all Israel with him, abandoned the law of Yahweh. And thus it happened that in the 5th year of King Rehoboam, Shishak king of Egypt marched on Jerusalem, because they had been unfaithful to Yahweh, with 1,200 chariots and 60,000 cavalry and countless hordes of Libyans, Sukkiim and Cushites who came from Egypt with him. They captured the fortified towns of Judah and reached Jerusalem. The prophet Shemaiah then came to Rehoboam and the generals of Judah, who had fallen back on Jerusalem before Shishak's advance, and said to them, Yahweh says this, You have abandoned me, and so I have abandoned you into Shishak's clutches. At this, The Israelite generals and the king humbled themselves and said, "Yahweh is just." When Yahweh saw that they had humbled themselves, the word of Yahweh came to Shemaiah as follows, "They have humbled themselves. I shall not destroy them but shall grant them some degree of deliverance. My retribution will not be poured out on Jerusalem by means of Shishak. They are nonetheless to become his slaves, so that they may learn the difference between serving me and serving kings of other countries." So Shishak king of Egypt advanced on Jerusalem and carried off the treasures of the temple and the treasures of the royal palace. He took everything away, including the golden shields which Solomon had made. To replace these, King Rehoboam made bronze shields, entrusting them to the commanders of the guard who guarded the king's palace gate. Whenever the king went to the temple of Yahweh, the guards would come out carrying them, returning them to the guardroom afterwards. Because King Rehoboam had humbled himself, the retribution of Yahweh turned away from him so as not to destroy him completely. And there were also some good features in Judah. Thus he was able to strengthen his position in Jerusalem and continue as king. For Rehoboam was 41 years old when he came to the throne and remained king for 17 years in Jerusalem, the city chosen by Yahweh from all the tribes of Israel to put his name there. His mother's name was Naamah the Ammonite. But he did wrong in not setting his heart on seeking Yahweh. The history of Rehoboam, from first to last, is this not all written down in the records of Shemaiah the prophet and of Iddo the seer? Warfare between Rehoboam and Jeroboam went on throughout the period. When Rehoboam fell asleep with his ancestors, he was buried in the city of David. His son Abijah succeeded him. 2 Chronicles, chapter 13. In the 18th year of King Jeroboam, Abijah became king of Judah and reigned for 3 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Micaiah, daughter of Uriel of Gibeah. When war broke out between Abijah and Jeroboam, Abijah took the field with an army of 400,000 picked warriors, while Jeroboam took the field against him with 800,000 picked warriors. Abijah took position on Mount Zemaraim, in the highlands of Ephraim. "Jeroboam and all Israel," he cried, "listen to me. Do you not know that Yahweh, God of Israel, has given eternal sovereignty of Israel to David and his sons by an inviolable covenant? Yet Jeroboam son of Nebat, the slave of Solomon son of David, rose in revolt against his master. Worthless men, scoundrels, rallied to him, proving too strong for Rehoboam son of Solomon, as Rehoboam was then inexperienced and timid and unable to resist them. And now you propose to resist Yahweh's sovereignty as exercised by the sons of David, because there is a great number of you and you have the golden calves that Jeroboam made you for gods. Have you not driven out the priests of Yahweh, the sons of Aaron and the Levites, to make priests of your own like the peoples of foreign countries? Anyone who comes with a bull and 7 rams to get himself consecrated can become priest of these gods that are no gods. But for our part, our God is Yahweh, and we have not abandoned him. Our priests are sons of Aaron who minister to Yahweh, and those who serve are Levites. Morning after morning, evening after evening, they present burnt offerings and perfumed incense to Yahweh. They put the bread of permanent offering on the clean table and nightly light the lamps on the golden lampstand. For we keep the decree of Yahweh our God, although you have abandoned him. See how God is with us, at our head, and his priests with trumpets to sound the alarm against you. Israelites, do not make war on Yahweh, God of your ancestors, for you will not succeed." Now Jeroboam had sent a party round to ambush them from the rear. Thus the main force confronted Judah, and the ambush lay to their rear. And when Judah looked round, they found themselves being attacked from front and rear. They called on Yahweh, the priests sounded the trumpets, and the men of Judah raised the war cry, and, as they raised the cry, God routed Jeroboam and all Israel before Abijah and Judah. So the Israelites fled before Judah, because God had given Judah the upper hand, and Abijah and his army inflicted a great slaughter on them. 500,000 of Israel's picked men fell, killed. So the Israelites were humbled on that occasion, while the Judeans won, since they had relied on Yahweh, God of their ancestors. Abijah pursued Jeroboam, taking from him the towns of Bethel with its dependencies, Jeshanah with its dependencies, and Ephron with its dependencies. Nor did Jeroboam regain strength during Abijah's lifetime. Eventually Yahweh struck him and he died, but Abijah grew stronger than ever. He married 14 wives and fathered 22 sons and 16 daughters. The rest of the history of Abijah, his conduct and his sayings, are recorded in the Midrash of the prophet Iddo. When Abijah fell asleep with his ancestors, he was buried in the city of David. His son Asa succeeded him. In his time the country was at peace for 10 years. Second Chronicles, chapter 14. Asa did what Yahweh his God regards as good and right. He abolished the foreign altars and the high places, broke the pillars, cut down the sacred poles, and urged Judah to seek Yahweh, God of their ancestors, and to observe the law and commandment. Because he abolished the high places and incense altars through the towns of Judah, the kingdom under him was undisturbed. He rebuilt the fortified towns of Judah, since the country was at peace and free of war during those years, because Yahweh had granted him peace. Let us rebuild these towns, he told Judah. Let us surround them with wall and tower, with gate and bar while the country is still ours. For we have sought Yahweh our God, and he has sought us and given us peace all around. They built and prospered. Asa had an army of 300,000 men of Judah armed with shields and spears, and 280,000 men of Benjamin armed with shields and bows, all of them outstanding soldiers. Zerah the Cushite took the field against them with an army 1,000,000 strong and 300 chariots, and penetrated to Mareshah. Asa took the field against him, and the battle lines were drawn up in the valley of Zephathah, at Mareshah. Asa then called on Yahweh his God and said, Yahweh, numbers and strength make no difference to you when you give your help. Help us, Yahweh our God, for, relying on you, we are confronting this horde in your name. Yahweh, you are our God. Human strength cannot prevail against you. Yahweh routed the Cushites before Asa and Judah. The Cushites fled, and Asa pursued them with his army as far as Gerar. So many of the Cushites fell that they were unable to survive. They were cut to pieces by Yahweh and his army. They carried off a great deal of booty. They destroyed all the towns round Gerar, for a panic from Yahweh had seized the towns, and plundered all the towns since they were full of loot. They also routed the cattle owners and carried off great numbers of sheep and camels. Then they returned to Jerusalem. Second Chronicles, chapter 15. The Spirit of God then came on Azariah son of Oded. He went out to meet Asa and said, Listen to me, Asa, and all you in Judah and in Benjamin. Yahweh will be with you so long as you are with him. If you seek him, he will let you find him. But if you desert him, he will desert you. For a long time Israel did not have the true God or a teacher priest or a law. But when in their distress they turned to Yahweh, God of Israel, and sought him, he let them find him. In those times there was no security for people as they went about their business, but great unrest affecting the inhabitants of all countries, nation being crushed by nation and city by city, since God caused confusion among them by every kind of distress. So be strong, do not be discouraged, for your deeds will be rewarded. When Asa heard these words in the prophecy, he took courage and removed the abominable idols throughout the land of Judah and Benjamin, as well as from the towns which he had captured in the highlands of Ephraim, and repaired the altar of Yahweh which stood in front of the portico of Yahweh. He summoned all Judah and Benjamin, as well as those Ephraimites, Manasseites, and Simonites who had settled with them. For a great many people from Israel had gone over to Asa when they saw that Yahweh his God was with him. They assembled in Jerusalem in the 3rd month of the 15th year of Asa's reign, that day sacrificing to Yahweh 700 oxen and 7,000 sheep from the booty which they had brought back. They then made a covenant to seek Yahweh, God of their ancestors, with all their heart and soul. Anyone who would not seek Yahweh, God of Israel, was to be put to death, whether high or low, man or woman. They pledged their oath to Yahweh in ringing tones, with shouts of joy, to the sound of trumpet and horn. All Judah rejoiced over the oath, for they had sworn it wholeheartedly, and sought him so earnestly that he allowed them to find him. Yahweh gave them peace all round. King Asa even deprived his mother Maacah of the dignity of great lady for having made an obscenity for Asherah. Asa cut down her obscenity, smashed it and burnt it in the ravine of the Kidron. Though the high places were not abolished in Israel, Asa's heart was loyal throughout his life. He deposited his father's and his own dedicated gifts of silver, gold and sacred vessels in the temple of Yahweh. Up to the 35th year of Asa's reign there was no war. Second Chronicles, chapter 16. In the 36th year of Asa's reign, Baasha king of Israel marched on Judah and fortified Ramah to block the communications of Asa king of Judah. Asa then took silver and gold from the treasuries of the temple of Yahweh and the royal palace and sent this with the following message to Ben-Hadad king of Aram, who lived in Damascus. Let us make an alliance between me and you, between my father and your father. Look, I have sent you silver and gold. Come, break off your alliance with Baasha king of Israel, which will make him withdraw from me. Ben-Hadad listened favorably to King Asa and sent the generals of his armies to attack the towns of Israel. He ravaged Ijon, Dan, Abel-maim and all the storage towns of Naphtali. When Baasha heard this, he gave up fortifying Ramah, abandoning this work. King Asa then had all Judah carry away the stones and timber with which Baasha had been fortifying Ramah, and used them to fortify Geba and Mizpah. Then it was that Hanani the seer came to Asa king of Judah and said, Because you relied on the king of Aram and not on Yahweh your God, the king of Aram's army will slip through your fingers. Did not the Cushites and Libyans form a vast army with great numbers of chariots and cavalry? Even so, because you relied on Yahweh, he gave you the upper hand. For Yahweh's eyes rove to and fro across the whole world to support those whose hearts are loyal to him. You have acted like a fool in this respect. Hence, from now on you will have wars. Enraged with the seer, Asa had him put in the stocks in prison, being angry with him over this. At the same time Asa ill-treated some of the people too. The history of Asa, from first to last, is recorded in the book of the kings of Judah and Israel. In the 39th year of his reign, Asa contracted a disease in his feet, which became very severe. In his illness, however, he consulted not Yahweh but the doctors. Asa then fell asleep with his ancestors, dying in the 41st year of his reign. He was buried in the tomb which he had ordered to be cut for him in the city of David. He was laid in the burial chamber which was filled with perfume blended from all sorts of oils, and a very great funeral fire was made for him. Second Chronicles, chapter 17. When his son Jehoshaphat succeeded him, he made himself stronger against Israel by stationing troops in all the fortified towns in Judah and by garrisoning Judah and the towns of Ephraim which his father Asa had captured. Yahweh was with Jehoshaphat because he followed the example of his father's earlier days and did not have recourse to Baal, but sought Yahweh, the God of his father, following his commandments and not behaving as Israel did. Because of this, Yahweh put him in secure control of the kingdom, while all Judah gave Jehoshaphat presents until ample riches and honor were his. He was so enthusiastic about obeying Yahweh that once again he abolished the high places and sacred poles in Judah. In the 3rd year of his reign he sent his leading men Ben-Hail, Obadiah, Zechariah, Nethanel and Micaiah, to give instruction in the towns of Judah. With them went the Levites, Shemaiah, Nethaniah, Zebediah, Asahel, Shemiramoth, Jehonathan, Adonijah and Tobijah. The Levites, Elishama and Jehoram the priests went with them. They gave instruction in Judah, having with them the book of the law of Yahweh, and went round all the towns of Judah instructing the people. A panic from Yahweh seized all the kings of the countries surrounding Judah, as a result of which they did not make war on Jehoshaphat. Some of the Philistines brought Jehoshaphat presents and a load of silver, and the Arabs brought him 7,700 rams and 7,700 he-goats. Jehoshaphat became more and more powerful, He built fortresses and storage towns in Judah. He accumulated ample supplies in the towns of Judah. He also had warriors, outstanding men, in Jerusalem. According to family, this is how they were classified. Over the commanders of the thousands of Judah was General Adnah, who had 300,000 outstanding men. Under him was General Jehohanan, who had 280,000. Under him was Amasiah son of Zichri, who had volunteered for Yahweh and who had 200,000 outstanding men. That outstanding soldier, Eliada, represented Benjamin, and he had 200,000 men armed with bow and shield. And under him, Jehozabad, who had 180,000 equipped for war. These were in attendance on the king, apart from those whom the king had stationed in the fortified towns all over Judah. Second Chronicles, chapter 18. Although Jehoshaphat enjoyed great wealth and honor, he allied himself by marriage to Ahab. After some years he paid a visit to Ahab in Samaria. Ahab slaughtered an immense number of sheep and oxen for him and his retinue, to induce him to attack Ramoth-Gilead. Ahab king of Israel then said to Jehoshaphat king of Judah, "Will you come with me to Ramoth-Gilead?" He replied, "I will share in battle with you, my men with yours." Jehoshaphat, however, said to the king of Israel, "First, please consult the word of Yahweh." So the king of Israel called the prophets together, 400 of them. "Should we go and attack Ramoth-Gilead," he asked, "or should I hold back?" "March," they replied, "for God will deliver it into the king's power." Jehoshaphat, however, said, "Is there no other prophet of Yahweh here for us to consult?" The king of Israel answered Jehoshaphat, "There is one more man through whom we can consult Yahweh, but I hate him because he never has a favorable prophecy for me, always unfavorable ones. He is Micaiah son of Imlah." "The king should not say such things," said Jehoshaphat. The king of Israel then summoned a court official and said, "Bring Micaiah son of Imlah immediately." The king of Israel and Jehoshaphat king of Judah were sitting each on his throne, wearing their robes, in an open space just outside the gate of Samaria, with all the prophets prophesying before them. Zedekiah son of Chenaanah, who had made himself some iron horns, said, "Yahweh says, with horns like these, you will gore the Arameans till you make an end of them." And all the prophets prophesied in the same vein, saying, "March on Ramoth-Gilead. Success is sure, for Yahweh has already given it to the king." The messenger who had gone to summon Micaiah said to him, "Look, what the prophets are saying is uniformly favorable to the king. So I hope you will say the same as they do and speak favorably." Micaiah said, "As Yahweh lives, I shall speak exactly as Yahweh tells me." When he came to the king said, "Micaiah, should we march to attack Ramoth-Gilead, or should I hold back?" He replied, "Go and conquer. Yahweh will deliver them into your power." The king went on, "How often must I put you on oath to tell me nothing but the truth in the name of Yahweh?" Then he spoke out, "I saw all Israel scattered on the mountains like sheep without a shepherd. And Yahweh said, 'These have no master, let them all go peacefully home.'" At this the king of Israel said to Jehoshaphat, "Did I not tell you that he never gives me favorable prophecies, but only unfavorable ones?" Micaiah went on, "Now listen to the word of Yahweh. I saw Yahweh seated on his throne with the whole array of heaven standing on his right and on his left. Yahweh said, 'Who will entice Ahab king of Israel into marching to his death at Ramoth-Gilead?' At which some answered one way, and some another. A spirit then came forward and stood before Yahweh and said, 'I will entice him.'" "How?" Yahweh asked. He replied, "I shall go and be a deceptive spirit in the mouths of all his prophets." Yahweh said, "You will succeed in enticing him. Go and do it." And now, you see, Yahweh has put a deceptive spirit into the mouths of your prophets here. For in fact Yahweh has pronounced disaster on you. Zedekiah son of Chenaanah then came up, struck Micaiah on the cheek and said, "Which way did Yahweh's spirit leave me, to speak to you? That is what you will find out, Micaiah retorted, the day you go from room to room trying to hide. The king of Israel said, Seize Micaiah and hand him over to Amon governor of the city, and Joash the king's son, and say, These are the king's orders. Put this man in prison and feed him on nothing but bread and water until I am safely home. Micaiah said, If you ever do get home safely, Yahweh has not spoken through me. The king of Israel and Jehoshaphat king of Judah marched on Ramoth-Gilead. The king of Israel said to Jehoshaphat, I shall disguise myself to go into battle, but you put on your robes. So the king of Israel disguised himself, and they went into battle. Now, the king of Aram had given his chariot commanders the following order, Do not attack anyone of whatever rank, except the king of Israel. So, when the chariot commanders saw Jehoshaphat, they thought, That is the king of Israel, and surrounded him to attack. But when Jehoshaphat shouted his war cry, Yahweh came to his help. God drew them away from him. For the chariot commanders, realizing that he was not the king of Israel, broke off their pursuit. Someone, however, drawing his bow without any special aim, shot the king of Israel between the joints of his armor. Turn about, he said to his charioteer. Get me out of the fighting. I am collapsing. But the battle grew fiercer as the day went on, and the king of Israel had to be held upright in his chariot facing the Arameans until the evening, and at sunset he died. Second Chronicles, chapter 19. Jehoshaphat king of Judah returned home safely, however, to Jerusalem. Jehu son of Hanani the seer went to meet him and said to King Jehoshaphat, Should a man give help to the wicked? Should you love those who hate Yahweh and so bring his retribution on yourself? All the same, there are good things to your credit, since you have removed the sacred poles from the country and have set your heart on seeking God. Jehoshaphat resided in Jerusalem but regularly went on progress among the people, from Beersheba to the highlands of Ephraim, to convert them to Yahweh, God of their ancestors. He also appointed judges in the country in every one of the fortified towns of Judah, saying to the judges, Be careful what you do, since you are judging not by any human power but in the name of Yahweh, who will be with you when you pronounce sentence. This being so, let fear of Yahweh govern you. Be careful what you do, for Yahweh our God will not tolerate malpractice, partiality, or the taking of bribes. Jehoshaphat also appointed some of the Levites, priests and heads of Israelite families in Jerusalem to settle disputes. They lived in Jerusalem, and Jehoshaphat gave them the following charge. In fear of Yahweh and with conscientious integrity, this is how you are to act. Whatever case your brothers living in other towns refer to you, whether involving blood feuds or law and commandment, statutes and judgments, you are to instruct them in such manner that they do not incur guilt before Yahweh and that you and your brothers do not incur his anger. If you act thus, you will not incur guilt. Amariah the chief priest himself will be your president in all religious cases, and Zebadiah son of Ishmael, leader of the house of Judah, in all civil ones, while the Levites will act as officers of the court. Be firm. Put this into practice, and may Yahweh protect the right. Second Chronicles, chapter 20. Sometime later, the Moabites and Ammonites, and with them the Meunites, advanced to war against Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat received the following intelligence. A vast horde is advancing on you from the other side of the sea, from Edom. They are already at Hazazon Tamar, that is, En-Gedi. Jehoshaphat was alarmed and resolved to have recourse to Yahweh. He proclaimed a fast throughout all Judah. So Judah assembled to seek help from Yahweh. To seek Yahweh they came from every town in Judah. Then, standing in the temple of Yahweh in front of the new court among the assembled people of Judah and Jerusalem, Jehoshaphat said, Yahweh, God of our ancestors, are you not God in heaven, and do you not rule all the kingdoms of the nations? Your power and might are such that no one can resist you. Did not you, our God, dispossess the inhabitants of this country for your people Israel and give it to the descendants of Abraham, your friend, forever? They have lived in it and built you a sanctuary there for your name, saying, if disaster, war, flood, pestilence or famine befall us, and we stand in front of this temple, before you, for your name is in this temple, and cry to you in our distress, then you will listen and rescue us. Now see, the Ammonites and Moabites and the people of Mount Seir, whom you would not allow Israel to invade when they came out of Egypt, on the contrary, Israel avoided them, and did not destroy them. See how they reward us, by coming to drive us out of your possession which you allotted to us. Our God, will you not pass sentence on them, since we are helpless against this vast horde about to attack us? Because we do not know what to do, we look to you. All Judah, including their families, wives, and children, were standing before Yahweh, when in the middle of the assembly, the Spirit of Yahweh came on Jahaziel son of Zechariah, son of Benaiah, son of Jeiel, son of Mattaniah the Levite, a member of the clan of Asaph, who then cried, Listen, all Judah and you citizens of Jerusalem, and you, King Jehoshaphat. Yahweh says this to you, do not be afraid, do not be daunted by this vast horde, for the war is not your affair but God's. Go down against them tomorrow. They are coming up by the slope of Ziz, and you will encounter them at the end of the ravine near the desert of Jeruel. You will not need to fight in this battle. Take up your position, stand firm, and see what salvation Yahweh has in store for you. Judah and Jerusalem, be fearless, be dauntless. March out against them tomorrow, and Yahweh will be with you. Jehoshaphat bowed his head, his face to the ground, and all Judah and the citizens of Jerusalem fell down before Yahweh to worship Yahweh. Then the Levites, both the Kohathites and Korahites, stood up to praise Yahweh, God of Israel, at the top of their voices. Early next morning they prepared to set out for the desert of Tekoa. As they were setting out, Jehoshaphat stood up and said, Listen to me, Judah and you citizens of Jerusalem. Believe in Yahweh your God and you will be secure. Believe in his prophets and you will be successful. Then, having conferred with the people, he appointed singers who were to praise Yahweh and go out ahead of the army in sacred vestments, singing praise Yahweh, for his faithful love endures forever. The moment they began their shouts of praise, Yahweh sprang an ambush on the Ammonites, Moabites, and the people of Mount Seir who were invading Judah, and that was the end of them. For the Ammonites and Moabites turned on the people of Mount Seir, and put them under the curse of destruction, and then, having finished off the people of Seir, set to work slaughtering one another. When Judah reached the point overlooking the desert and looked towards the horde, there were nothing but corpses lying on the ground. No one escaped. When Jehoshaphat arrived to take the booty, they found quantities of cattle and innumerable possessions, clothes and valuables, which they seized for themselves. It was impossible to carry it, and it took them 3 days to collect it. On the 4th day they assembled in the valley of Barakah, where they blessed Yahweh. Hence the place was given the name Valley of Barakah, which it still has today. Then all the men of Judah and Jerusalem returned joyfully to Jerusalem with Jehoshaphat at their head, as Yahweh had given them cause to rejoice over their enemies. To the sound of lyre, harp, and trumpet they came to Jerusalem, to the temple of Yahweh. And a panic from Yahweh seized all the neighboring kings when they heard how Yahweh had fought against the enemies of Israel. And henceforth Jehoshaphat's reign was undisturbed, for his God gave him peace all round. So Jehoshaphat reigned over Judah. He was 35 years old when he came to the throne, and he reigned for 25 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Azubah, daughter of Shilhi. He followed the example of his father Asa undeviatingly, doing what Yahweh regards as right. The high places, however, were not abolished. The people had still not set their hearts on the God of their ancestors. The rest of the history of Jehoshaphat, from first to last, is written down in the records of Jehu son of Hanani, which are quoted in the book of the kings of Israel. Afterwards, Jehoshaphat formed a partnership with Ahaziah king of Israel, which was very wrong of him. He joined him in building some ships to go to Tarshish. They built them at Ezion-Geber. Eleazar son of Dodavahu of Mareshah then prophesied against Jehoshaphat as follows: Because you have become Ahaziah's partner, Yahweh has wrecked your efforts. The ships were wrecked and were never fit to sail for Tarshish. Second Chronicles, chapter 21. Then Jehoshaphat fell asleep with his ancestors and was buried with them in the city of David. His son Jehoram succeeded him. Jehoram's brothers, sons of Jehoshaphat, were Azariah, Jehiel, Zechariah, Azariahu, Michael and Shephatiah, all of them sons of Jehoshaphat king of Israel. Their father had lavishly given them presents of silver, gold and other valuables, as well as fortified towns in Judah. But the throne he bequeathed to Jehoram, since he was the firstborn. Jehoram, having taken control of his father's kingdom and secured his own position, put all his brothers to the sword and some officials of Israel too. Jehoram was 32 years old when he came to the throne, and he reigned for 8 years in Jerusalem. He followed the example of the kings of Israel as the house of Ahab were doing, he having married one of Ahab's daughters, and he did what is displeasing to Yahweh. But Yahweh would not destroy the house of David, because of the covenant which he had made with David, promising to provide him and his sons with a lamp forever. In his time Edom threw off the domination of Judah and set up a king for itself. Jehoram crossed the frontier, and with him his commanders and all his chariots. Under cover of dark, he and his chariot commanders broke through the Edomites surrounding him. Thus Edom threw off the domination of Judah and has remained free to the present day. Libnah revolted against him at the same time, because he had abandoned Yahweh, God of his ancestors. What is more, he set up high places in the highlands of Judah, leading the citizens of Jerusalem and the people of Judah into apostasy. Something written by the prophet Elijah then came into his hands. It said, "Yahweh, God of your ancestor David, says this, since you have not followed the example of your father Jehoshaphat or of Asa king of Judah, but have followed the example of the kings of Israel and have led Judah and the citizens of Jerusalem into apostasy, just as the house of Ahab has led Israel into apostasy, and have even murdered your brothers, your own family, who were better men than you, Yahweh is going to afflict your people, your sons, your wives, and all your property with a great calamity, and you yourself with a severe disease affecting your bowels, as a result of which disease, continuing day after day, you will suffer protrusion of your bowels." Yahweh then roused the hostility of the Philistines and of the Arabs living near the Cushites against Jehoram. They invaded Judah, forcing their way into it and carrying off all the property to be found in the king's palace, as well as his sons and his wives, so that he was left no sons at all except his youngest son Jehoahaz. And after all this, Yahweh afflicted him with an incurable disease of the bowels. In due time, after about 2 years, his bowels protruded as a result of his disease, and he died in acute pain. His people did not make a funeral pyre for him, as they had for his ancestors. He was 32 years old when he came to the throne, and he reigned for 8 years in Jerusalem. He passed away unlamented and was buried in the city of David, though not in the tombs of the kings. Second Chronicles, chapter 22. The inhabitants of Jerusalem then made his youngest son Ahaziah king in succession to him, since the marauders who had attacked the camp with the Arabs had killed all the older ones. That was why Ahaziah son of Jehoram, king of Judah, became king. Ahaziah was 42 years old when he came to the throne, and he reigned for 1 year in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Athaliah, descendant of Omri. He too followed the example of the house of Ahab, for his mother being his adviser brought about his condemnation. He did what is displeasing to Yahweh as the house of Ahab did, for they were his advisers after his father's death, to his undoing. He followed their advice and went with Jehoram son of Ahab, king of Israel, to make war on Hazael king of Aram at Ramoth-Gilead. But the Arameans wounded Jehoram, who returned to Jezreel to recover from the wounds which he had received at Ramoth, fighting against Hazael king of Aram. Ahaziah son of Jehoram, king of Judah, went down to Jezreel to visit Jehoram son of Ahab because he was ailing. Through this visit to Jehoram, God brought ruin on Ahaziah. On his arrival he went out with Jehoram to meet Jehu son of Nimshi, whom Yahweh had anointed to make an end of the house of Ahab. While Jehu was executing sentence on the house of Ahab and came across the officers of Judah and Ahaziah's nephews who were in attendance on Ahaziah, he killed them, and then went in search of Ahaziah. The latter was captured while hiding in Samaria, and taken to Jehu, who put him to death. But they gave him burial because, they said, he was the grandson of Jehoshaphat who sought Yahweh with all his heart. As a result, there was no member of Ahaziah's family left who was strong enough to rule the kingdom. When Athaliah, mother of Ahaziah, learned that her son was dead, she promptly did away with all the royal stock of the house of Judah. But Jehosheba, the king's daughter, surreptitiously rescued Joash son of Ahaziah from among the chiefs who were to be murdered, and put him with his nurse in the sleeping quarters. In this way Jehosheba, daughter of King Joram and wife of Jehoiada the priest, she was the sister of Ahaziah, hid him from Athaliah, and he was not put to death. He stayed hidden with them in the temple of God for 6 years, while Athaliah governed the country. Second Chronicles, chapter 23. In the 7th year Jehoiada decided to take action and made a pact with the regimental commanders, Azariah son of Jeraham, Ishmael son of Jehohanan, Azariah son of Obed, Messiah son of Adaiah, and Elishaphat son of Zichri. These went all over Judah, gathering the Levites from all the towns of Judah, and the heads of the Israelite families, who then came to Jerusalem, and the whole assembly made a pact with the king in the temple of God. Jehoiada said to them, "Look, the king's son is now to be king, as Yahweh has promised of the sons of David. This is what you must do. A third of you priests and Levites who come on duty on the Sabbath must guard the gates, a third the royal palace, a third the foundation gate, while the people must all stay in the courts of the temple of Yahweh. No one must enter the temple of Yahweh except the priests and the ministering Levites. They may come in because they are consecrated, but the people must all observe Yahweh's regulations. The Levites must surround the king, each man with his weapons in his hands. Anyone who enters the temple must be killed. And you will escort the king when he comes in and when he leaves." The Levites and all Judah did everything as Jehoiada the priest had ordered, and each one brought his men, those coming on duty on the Sabbath and those going off duty on the Sabbath. For Jehoiada the priest had not released any of the divisions from duty. Jehoiada the priest then issued the regimental commanders with King David's spears and large and small shields, which were kept in the temple of God. He then positioned all the people, each man with his weapon in his hand, from the south side of the temple to the north side of the temple, close to the altar and the temple, to form a circle round the king. Then they brought the king's son out, crowned him, gave him a copy of the covenant, and made him king. When Jehoiada and his sons had anointed him, they shouted, "Long live the king!" On hearing the people shouting as they ran to acclaim the king, Athaliah joined the people in the temple of Yahweh. When she looked, there stood the king on his dais by the entrance, with the officers and trumpeters at the king's side, and all the people of the country rejoicing and blowing the trumpets, and the singers with their musical instruments leading the hymns of praise. Then Athaliah tore her cloths and shouted, "Treason! Treason!" Jehoiada the priest then gave the order to the regimental commanders in charge of the troops, "Take her out between the ranks and put to the sword anyone who follows her." For the priest had already said, "Do not kill her inside the temple of Yahweh." So they made way for her, and when she reached the entrance to the horses' gate of the palace, they killed her there. Jehoiada made a covenant between himself, all the people and the king to remain Yahweh's people. All the people then went to the temple of Baal and demolished it. They smashed its altars and its images and killed Mutton the priest of Baal in front of the altars. Jehoiada entrusted the security of the temple of Yahweh to the priests and Levites, whom David had put in charge of the temple of Yahweh to present the burnt offerings of Yahweh as laid down in the law of Moses, with joy and song as ordained by David. He also appointed gatekeepers for the gates of the temple of Yahweh, so that no one who was unclean might enter for any purpose at all. He then took the regimental commanders, the nobles, the government officials, and all the people of the land, and he escorted the king down from the temple of Yahweh. Entering the palace through the upper gate, They placed the king on the royal throne. All the people of the land were delighted, and the city made no move after Athaliah had been put to death. Second Chronicles, chapter 24. Joash was 7 years old when he came to the throne, and he reigned for 40 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Zibiah of Beersheba. Joash did what Yahweh regards as right throughout the lifetime of Jehoiada the priest. Jehoiada found him 2 wives, and he fathered several sons and daughters. Later, Joash made up his mind to repair the temple of Yahweh. Calling the priests and the Levites together, he said, "Go out to the towns of Judah and collect money from all Israel for annual repairs to the temple of Yahweh. Do this quickly." But the Levites were in no hurry, so the king summoned Jehoiada the chief priest and said, "Why have you not insisted on the Levites bringing in the tax from Judah and Jerusalem for the tent of witness, as imposed by Moses servant of Yahweh and the community of Israel?" Athaliah and her sons, whom she corrupted, despoiled the temple of God and even assigned all the sacred revenues of the temple of Yahweh to Baal. So, at the king's order, a chest was made and put outside the gate of the temple of Yahweh, and a proclamation was issued throughout Judah and Jerusalem that the tax, which Moses servant of God had imposed on Israel in the desert, was to be brought to Yahweh. Then all the officials and all the people gladly brought in their contributions, depositing them in the chest until the payment was complete. Whenever the chest was brought by the Levites for royal inspection and found to contain a large sum of money, the king's secretary and the chief priest's representative would come and empty the chest and then have it returned to its place. This was done day after day, and a great deal of money was collected. The king and Jehoiada handed it over to the foreman attached to the temple of Yahweh, and the hired masons and carpenters set about repairing the temple of Yahweh, and iron workers and bronze workers labored to repair the temple of Yahweh. The workmen got on with the task. The repair work made good progress at their hands, until they had restored the temple of God to its former state and reconditioned it. When they had finished, they brought the balance of the money to the king and Jehoiada, and with this vessels were made for the temple of Yahweh, vessels for the liturgy and for the burnt offerings, bowls and other gold and silver vessels. And the perpetual burnt offering was offered in the temple of Yahweh throughout Jehoiada's lifetime. But Jehoiada, growing old, had his fill of days and died. He died at the age of 130 years, and was buried with the kings in the city of David because he had served Israel and God and his temple well. After Jehoiada's death, the officials of Judah came to pay court to the king, and the king listened to their advice, and they abandoned the temple of Yahweh, God of their ancestors, for the worship of sacred poles and idols. Judah and Jerusalem incurred wrath because of this guilt of theirs. He sent their prophets to lead them back to Yahweh. These put the case against them, but they would not listen. The Spirit of God then invested Zechariah son of Jehoiada the priest. He stood up before the people and said, "God says this, why transgress Yahweh's commands to your certain ruin? For if you abandon Yahweh, he will abandon you." They then plotted against him and, at the king's order, stoned him in the court of the temple of Yahweh. Thus King Joash, forgetful of the devotion which Jehoiada father of Zechariah had displayed on his behalf, murdered his son, who cried out as he died, "Yahweh will see this and avenge it." At the turn of the year, the Aramean army made war on Joash. When they reached Judah and Jerusalem, they massacred all the nation's government officials and sent all their booty to the king of Damascus. Although the invading Aramean army was only a small body of men, Yahweh allowed them to defeat a very large army because they had abandoned Yahweh, God of their ancestors. Thus they executed judgment on Joash, after they had retired, for they left him seriously wounded. His own retainers plotted against him to avenge the blood of the son of Jehoiada the priest and murdered him in his bed. When he died, he was buried in the city of David, but not in the tombs of the kings. These were the conspirators, Zabad son of Shimeth the Ammonite and Jehozabad son of Shimrith the Moabite. As regards his sons, the heavy tribute imposed on him, and the restoration of the temple of God, this is recorded in the commentary on the Book of the Kings. His son Amaziah succeeded him. 2 Chronicles, chapter 25. Amaziah was 25 years old when he came to the throne, and he reigned for 29 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Jehoaddan of Jerusalem. He did what Yahweh regards as right, though not wholeheartedly. Once the kingdom was firmly under his control, he killed those of his retainers who had murdered the king his father. But he did not put their sons to death. This was in accordance with what is written in the law, in the book of Moses, where Yahweh had commanded, "Parents may not be put to death for children, nor children for parents, but each must be put to death for his own crime." Amaziah summoned Judah and organized all Judah and Benjamin by families under commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds. He also made a register of those who were 20 years old and upwards, and found there were 300,000 picked men, ready for service and capable of wielding spear and shield. Furthermore, he hired 100,000 tough fighting men from Israel for 100 talents of silver. A man of God then came to him and said, "My lord king, do not let the Israelite troops march with you, for Yahweh is not with Israel or with any of the Ephraimites. For however valiantly you act in war, God will bring you down before the enemy. For God has the power to uphold or to throw down." Amaziah said to the man of God, "But what about the 100 talents which I have paid for the Israelite troops?" "Yahweh can give you far more than that," said the man of God. At this, Amaziah dismissed the troops who had come to him from Ephraim and sent them home again. They were furious with Judah and went home in a great rage. Amaziah then, coming to a decision, led out his own troops and, having reached the Valley of Salt, struck down 10,000 Sirites. The men of Judah captured 10,000 more alive and, taking them to the summit of the rock, threw them off the summit of the rock so that they were all dashed to pieces. Meanwhile, the troops whom Amaziah had dismissed and not allowed to go into battle with him razed the towns of Judah, from Samaria to Beth-horon, killing 3,000 of their inhabitants and capturing great quantities of plunder. On returning from his slaughter of the Edomites, Amaziah brought the gods of the Sirites with him. He set these up as his gods, bowing down before them and burning incense to them. Yahweh's anger was aroused by Amaziah, and he sent him a prophet, who said to him, "Why do you consult those people's gods when they could not save their own people from your clutches?" He was still speaking when Amaziah interrupted him. "Have we appointed you a royal counselor? Stop, as you value your life." So the prophet stopped, and then said, "I know that God has decided to destroy you for having done this and for not listening to my advice." After consultation, Amaziah king of Judah then sent a message to Joash son of Jehoahaz son of Jehu, king of Israel, saying, "Come and make a trial of strength." Joash king of Israel sent back word to Amaziah king of Judah. The thistle of Lebanon sent a message to the cedar of Lebanon, saying, "Give my son your daughter in marriage." But a wild animal of the Lebanon ran over the thistle and squashed it. "Look at me, the conqueror of Edom," you say, "and now aspire to even greater glory. But stay where you belong. Why challenge disaster, to your own and Judah's ruin?" But Amaziah would not listen, for this was an act of God to deliver them up for having consulted the gods of Edom. So Joash king of Israel marched to the attack, and at Beth-shemesh, which belongs to Judah, he and Amaziah king of Judah made their trial of strength. Judah was defeated by Israel, and everyone fled to his tent. The king of Judah, Amaziah son of Joash, son of Ahaziah, was taken prisoner at Beth-shemesh by Joash king of Israel, who led him off to Jerusalem, where he demolished 400 cubits of the city wall between the Ephraim gate and the corner gate. He then took back with him to Samaria all the gold and silver, and all the vessels to be found in the temple of God in the care of Obed-Edom, the treasures in the palace, and hostages besides. Amaziah son of Joash, king of Judah, lived for 15 years after the death of Joash son of Jehoahaz, king of Israel. The rest of the history of Amaziah, from first to last, is this not recorded in the book of the kings of Judah and Israel? Some time after Amaziah had defected from Yahweh, a plot having been hatched against him in Jerusalem, he fled to Lachish, where he was murdered. He was then transported by horse and buried with his ancestors in the city of David. Second Chronicles, chapter 26. All the people then chose Uzziah, who was 16 years old, and made him king in succession to his father Amaziah. It was he who rebuilt Elath, recovering it for Judah, after the king had fallen asleep with his ancestors. Uzziah was 16 years old when he came to the throne, and he reigned for 52 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Jechaliah of Jerusalem. He did what is pleasing to Yahweh, just as his father Amaziah had done. He consulted God throughout the lifetime of Zechariah, who instructed him in the fear of God. And as long as he consulted Yahweh, God gave him success. He went on campaign against the Philistines, demolished the walls of Gath, the walls of Jabneh and the walls of Ashdod, and built towns in the area of Ashdod and elsewhere in Philistine territory. God helped him against the Philistines, the Arabs living at Girbal and the Munites. The Munites paid tribute to Uzziah, and his fame spread as far as the frontier of Egypt, since he kept growing stronger and stronger. Uzziah built towers in Jerusalem, at the corner gate, at the valley gate and at the angle, and fortified them. He built towers in the desert too, and dug many storage wells, for he had large herds in the lowlands and on the tableland, and farmers and vine dressers in the hills and fertile lands, for he loved the land. Uzziah had a trained army ready to go on campaign, organized in companies manned as detailed by the scribe Jeiel and the staff officer Messiah, and commanded by Hananiah, one of the king's generals. The heads of families of the military champions numbered in all 2,600. Under them was an army of 307,500 men ready for war, a powerful force to support the king against the enemy. Uzziah provided shields, spears, helmets, armor, bows and slingstones for the entire army. He also erected expertly contrived devices for the towers and angles of Jerusalem from which to shoot arrows and drop large stones. His fame spread far and wide, for he was miraculously helped to become strong. But once he was strong, his arrogance was such that it led to his downfall. He was unfaithful to Yahweh his God by entering the temple of Yahweh to burn incense on the altar of incense. Azariah the priest with 8 brave priests of Yahweh followed him in. Confronting King Uzziah, they said to him, "Uzziah, you are not allowed to burn incense to Yahweh. Only the Aaronite priests consecrated for the purpose may burn incense. Leave the sanctuary, for you have been unfaithful and will have no honor from Yahweh God." Uzziah, censer in hand to burn incense, flew into a rage. But while he was raging at the priests, a virulent skin disease broke out on his forehead in the presence of the priests, in the temple of Yahweh, there by the altar of incense. When Azariah the chief priest and all the other priests turned towards him, there was skin disease on his forehead, and they hurried him outside, and he himself was equally anxious to get out, because Yahweh had struck him. King Uzziah was afflicted with skin disease till his dying day. Because of this, he lived confined to his room and was excluded from the temple of Yahweh, while Jotham his son, who was master of the palace, governed the people of the country. The rest of the history of Uzziah, from first to last, has been written by the prophet Isaiah son of Amoz. Then Uzziah fell asleep with his ancestors and was buried with them in the field beside the burial ground of the king, since, it was reasoned, he was afflicted with virulent skin disease. His son Jotham then succeeded him. Second Chronicles, chapter 27. Jotham was 25 years old when he came to the throne, and he reigned for 16 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Jerusha, daughter of Zadok. He did what Yahweh regards as right, just as his father Uzziah had done. Only he did not enter Yahweh's sanctuary. But the people continued to do wrong. It was he who built the upper gate of the temple of Yahweh and carried out considerable work on the wall of the offal. He also built towns in the highlands of Judah and built forts and towers in the wooded areas. He also went to war against the king of the Ammonites and defeated them. And the Ammonites had to give him 100 talents of silver, 10,000 kor of wheat and 10,000 of barley that year. And the Ammonites paid him the same amount, the second and third years afterwards. Jotham became powerful because he kept an unswerving course before Yahweh his God. The rest of the history of Jotham, all his wars and his policy, are recorded in the book of the kings of Israel and Judah. He was 25 years old when he came to the throne, and he reigned for 16 years in Jerusalem. Then Jotham fell asleep with his ancestors, and was buried in the city of David. His son Ahaz succeeded him. 2 Chronicles, chapter 28. Ahaz was 20 years old when he came to the throne, and he reigned for 16 years in Jerusalem. He did not do what Yahweh regards as right, as his ancestor David had done. He followed the example of the kings of Israel, even having images cast for the Baals. He burned incense in the valley of Ben-Hinnom, caused his sons to pass through the fire of sacrifice, copying the disgusting practices of the nations whom Yahweh had dispossessed for the Israelites. He offered sacrifices and incense on the high places, on the hills and under every green tree. So Yahweh his God put him at the mercy of the king of Aram, who defeated him and took large numbers of captives, carrying them off to Damascus. He also put him at the mercy of the king of Israel, who inflicted heavy casualties on him. In a single day, Pekah son of Remaliah killed 120,000 in Judah, all of them prominent men, because they had abandoned Yahweh, God of their ancestors. Zikri, an Ephraimite champion, killed Messiah the king's son, Azrikam the controller of the household, and Elkanah the king's second-in-command. Of their brothers, the Israelites took 200,000 captive, including wives, sons, daughters. They also took quantities of booty, carrying everything off to Samaria. Now there was a prophet of Yahweh there by the name of Oded, who went out to meet the troops returning to Samaria and said, "Look, because Yahweh, God of your ancestors, was angry with Judah, he put them at your mercy, but you have slaughtered them with such fury as reached to heaven, and now you propose to reduce the children of Judah and Jerusalem to being your male and female slaves. Have you not yourselves committed sins against Yahweh your God? Now listen to me. Release the captives you have taken from your brothers, for the fierce anger of Yahweh hangs over you." Some of the Ephraimite chieftains, Azariah son of Jehohanan, Berechiah son of Meshillemoth, Jehizkiah son of Shallum, and Amasa son of Hadlai, then protested to those returning from the war and said to them, "You must not bring the captives here, for we have already sinned against Yahweh, and you propose to add to our sin and guilt, although our guilt is already great, and fierce anger is hanging over Israel." So in the presence of the officials and whole assembly, the soldiers gave up the captives and the booty. Men nominated for the purpose then took charge of the captives. From the booty they clothed all those of them who were naked. They gave them clothing and sandals, provided them with food and drink, mounted on donkeys all those who were infirm, and took them back to Jericho, the city of palm trees, though their brothers. Then they returned to Samaria. This was when King Ahaz sent asking the king of Assyria to come to his assistance. The Edomites again invaded, defeated Judah, and carried off captives, while the Philistines raided the towns in the lowlands and in the Negeb of Judah, capturing Beth-Shemesh, Aijalon, Gederoth, Soko and its dependencies, Timnah and its dependencies, and Gimzo and its dependencies, and settled there. For Yahweh brought Judah low because of Ahaz king of Israel, since he behaved without restraint in Judah and had been unfaithful to Yahweh. Tiglath-Pileser king of Assyria attacked and besieged him, but he could not overpower him. Although Ahaz robbed the temple of Yahweh and the palaces of the king and princes and gave the proceeds to the king of Assyria, he received no help from him. During the time when he was under siege, he disobeyed Yahweh even more grossly, this king Ahaz. For he offered sacrifices to the gods of Damascus who had defeated him. Since the gods of the kings of Aram, he thought, have supported them, I shall sacrifice to them, and perhaps they will help me. But they proved to be his and all Israel's downfall. Ahaz then collected the equipment of the temple of God, broke up the equipment of the temple of God, sealed the doors of the temple of Yahweh, and put his own altars in every corner of Jerusalem. He set up high places in every town of Judah to burn incense to other gods, thus provoking the anger of Yahweh, God of his ancestors. The rest of his history, his whole policy, from first to last, is recorded in the book of the kings of Judah and Israel. Then Ahaz fell asleep with his ancestors and was buried in the city, in Jerusalem, though he was not taken to the tombs of the kings of Israel. His son Hezekiah succeeded him. 2 Chronicles, chapter 29. Hezekiah was 25 years old when he came to the throne, and he reigned for 29 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Abijah, daughter of Zechariah. He did what Yahweh regards as right, just as his ancestor David had done. In the first month of the first year of his reign, he opened the doors of the temple of Yahweh, having repaired them. He then brought in the priests and the Levites, assembled them in the eastern square, and said to them, "Listen to me, Levites. First sanctify yourselves, then sanctify the temple of Yahweh, God of your ancestors, and remove the filth from the sanctuary. Our ancestors were unfaithful, and did what is displeasing to Yahweh our God. They abandoned him, turned their faces away from Yahweh's home, and turned their backs on him. They even closed the doors of the portico, put out the lamps, and stopped burning incense and making burnt offerings in the sanctuary of the God of Israel. This was why Yahweh's anger fell on Judah and Jerusalem, and he made them an object of terror, astonishment, and derision, as you can see for yourselves. Yes, our ancestors were put to the sword, and our sons, our daughters, and our wives were taken captive because of this. I am now determined to make a covenant with Yahweh, God of Israel, so that his fierce anger may turn away from us. Now, my sons, do not be remiss, for Yahweh has chosen you to stand in his presence and serve him by conducting his worship and offering him incense." The Levites said about it, Mahath son of Amasai and Joel son of Azariah, from the Kohathites, Kish son of Abdi and Azariah son of Jehalel, from the Merarites, Joah son of Zimmah and Eden son of Joah, from the Gershonites, Shimri and Jewel, of the sons of Elizaphan, Zechariah and Mattaniah of the sons of Asaph, Jehiel and Shimi of the sons of Heman, Shemaiah and Uzziel of the sons of Jeduthun, and gathered their brothers together. They sanctified themselves, and in obedience to the king's order, in accordance with the words of Yahweh, they came to purify the temple of Yahweh. The priests went into the inner part of the temple of Yahweh to purify it. They brought all the unclean things which they found in Yahweh's sanctuary out into the court of the temple of Yahweh, where the Levites collected them and took them out to the Kidron Valley. They began sanctifying on the first day of the first month, and by the 8th day of the month had reached Yahweh's portico. Thus they took 8 days to sanctify the temple of Yahweh, and by the 16th day of the first month everything was finished. They then waited on King Hezekiah and said, "We have purified the whole temple of Yahweh, the altar of burnt offering with all its equipment, and the table for the loaves of permanent offering with all their equipment. We have also got ready and sanctified all the equipment which King Ahaz in his infidelity had removed during his reign. It is all ready in front of Yahweh's altar." King Hezekiah lost no time but called the officials of the city together and went up to the temple of Yahweh. They brought 7 bulls, 7 rams, 7 lambs, and 7 goats as a sin sacrifice for the royal house, for the sanctuary, and for Judah, and he ordered the Aaronite priests to offer them on Yahweh's altar. So they slaughtered the bulls, and the priests took the blood and sprinkled it over the altar. They then slaughtered the rams and sprinkled the blood over the altar, and they slaughtered the lambs and sprinkled the blood over the altar. Then they brought the goats, the sacrifice for sin, before the king and the assembly, who laid their hands on them. The priests slaughtered them and made a sacrifice for sin with their blood at the altar to expiate for all Israel, since the king had ordered the burnt offering and the sacrifice for sin on behalf of all Israel. He positioned the Levites in the temple of Yahweh with cymbals, lyres, and harps, in accordance with the ordinance of David, of Gad the king's seer, and of Nathan the prophet, for such was Yahweh's order conveyed through his prophets. When the Levites stood with David's musical instruments, and the priests with the trumpets, Hezekiah ordered the burnt offering to be presented on the altar. And as the burnt offering began, the hymns of Yahweh began too, and the trumpets sounded, to the accompaniment of the instruments of David king of Israel, while the whole congregation worshipped, the singers singing and the trumpeters sounding the trumpets, continuously until the burnt offering was over. When the burnt offering was finished, the king and all those present with him fell to their knees and worshipped. Then King Hezekiah and the officials told the Levites to sing praise to Yahweh in the words of David and Asaph the seer. And joyfully they sang their praises, then knelt in worship. Hezekiah spoke again, "Now that you have consecrated yourselves to Yahweh, come forward and bring thanksgiving sacrifices to the temple of Yahweh." Then the congregation brought thanksgiving sacrifices, and those who were generous brought burnt offerings. The number of burnt offerings brought by the congregation was 70 bulls, 100 rams and 200 lambs, all as burnt offerings for Yahweh. The consecrated gifts amounted to 600 bulls and 3,000 sheep. The priests were too few, however, and were unable to dismember all the burnt offerings, so their brothers, the Levites, helped them until the work was finished and the priests had sanctified themselves. For the Levites had been more conscientious about sanctifying themselves than the priests had. In addition to the abundance of burnt offerings, there were also the fatty pieces for communion sacrifices and the libations for the burnt offerings. And so the liturgy of Yahweh's temple was restored, and Hezekiah and all the people rejoiced over what God had provided for the people, since everything had happened so suddenly. 2 Chronicles, chapter 30. Hezekiah sent messengers to all Israel and Judah, and also wrote letters to Ephraim and Manasseh, bidding them come to the temple of Yahweh in Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover in honor of Yahweh, God of Israel. For the king and his officials and the whole congregation in Jerusalem had agreed to celebrate the Passover in the 2nd month, having been unable to celebrate it at the proper time, since the priests had not purified themselves in sufficient number, and the people were not assembled in Jerusalem. And since this arrangement seemed fitting to the king and the whole congregation, they resolved to send a proclamation throughout Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, calling on the people to come to Jerusalem and celebrate a Passover in honor of Yahweh, God of Israel, since they had not celebrated it in a body as prescribed. So, by order of the king, courtiers set out with letters from the king and his officials for every part of Israel and Judah, saying, "Israelites, return to Yahweh, God of Abraham, Isaac and Israel, and he will return to those of you who are left and have escaped the grasp of the kings of Assyria. Do not be like your fathers and brothers who were unfaithful to Yahweh, God of their ancestors. He brought them to ruin, as you can see. Do not be stubborn like your ancestors. Submit to Yahweh, come to his sanctuary which he has consecrated forever, and serve Yahweh your God, so that his fierce anger may turn away from you. For if you return to Yahweh, your brothers and your sons will be treated mercifully by their captors and be allowed to return to this country. For Yahweh your God is gracious and merciful and will not turn his face away from you, if you return to him." The courtiers went from town to town through the territory of Ephraim and Manasseh and as far as Zebulun, but the people laughed and scoffed at them. Even so, some people from Asher and Manasseh and Zebulun were humble enough to come to Jerusalem, while in Judah the hand of God was also at work, inspiring a unanimous desire to obey the order of the king and the officials in accordance with the word of Yahweh. A huge crowd assembled in Jerusalem to celebrate the Feast of Unleavened Bread in the 2nd month. An immense crowd set to work removing the altars then in Jerusalem. They also removed all the incense altars and threw them into the Kidron Valley. They then slaughtered the Passover victims on the 14th day of the 2nd month. Ashamed of themselves, the priests and Levites had in the meanwhile sanctified themselves and brought burnt offerings to the temple of Yahweh, so they now stood in their positions prescribed in the law of Moses man of God, the priests sprinkling the blood handed to them by the Levites. Since many people in the congregation had not sanctified themselves, the Levites took care of the slaughter of the Passover victims to consecrate them to Yahweh for all who were not clean. For a great many people, especially from Ephraim, Manasseh, Issachar and Zebulun, had not purified themselves, since they did not eat the Passover as prescribed. But Hezekiah prayed for them as follows: "May Yahweh in his goodness pardon everyone whose heart is set on seeking God, Yahweh, God of his ancestors, even if he has not been purified as holy things demand. Yahweh listened to Hezekiah and left the people unharmed. Amid great rejoicing, the Israelites present in Jerusalem celebrated the Feast of Unleavened Bread for 7 days, while day after day the Levites and the priests praised Yahweh with all their might. Hezekiah then encouraged all the Levites who had such understanding of Yahweh. Having finished the 7-day festival, during which they sacrificed communion sacrifices and praised Yahweh, God of their ancestors, the whole congregation decided to celebrate for a further 7 days. So they joyfully celebrated for another 7 days, Hezekiah king of Judah contributing 1,000 bulls and 7,000 sheep for the congregation, and the officials another 1,000 bulls and 10,000 sheep. And a large number of priests sanctified themselves. The whole congregation of Judah, the priests, the Levites, the whole congregation coming from Israel and the foreigners coming from the territory of Israel as well as those resident in Judah, rejoiced. There was great rejoicing in Jerusalem, for since the days of Solomon son of David, king of Israel, nothing comparable had ever occurred in Jerusalem. The Levitical priests then stood up and blessed the people, and their voice was heard, and their prayer reached his holy dwelling in heaven. Second Chronicles, chapter 31. When all this was complete, all Israel present went out to the towns of Judah, broke the pillars, cut down the sacred poles, wrecked the high places and the altars, and did away with them entirely throughout Judah, Benjamin, Ephraim, and Manasseh. Then all the Israelites returned to their towns, everyone to his property. Hezekiah re-established the priestly and Levitical orders, each man in his proper order according to his duties, whether priest or Levite, to bring burnt offerings and communion sacrifices, to serve and to give thanks and praise within the gates of Yahweh's camp. He also established a king's portion from his possessions for the morning and evening burnt offerings, and the burnt offerings for the Sabbaths, new moons and festivals, as laid down in the law of Yahweh. He furthermore requested the people living in Jerusalem to present the portion for the priests and Levites so that they might devote themselves to the law of Yahweh. As soon as the order had been promulgated, the Israelites provided the first fruits of grain, new wine, olive oil, honey, and every other kind of agricultural produce in abundance. They brought in an abundant tithe of everything. The Israelites and Judeans living in the towns of Judah also brought in the tithe of cattle and sheep, and the tithe of sacred gifts consecrated to Yahweh their God, laying them in heaps. They began accumulating the heaps in the 3rd month and had finished them by the 7th. When Hezekiah and the officials came to inspect the heaps, they praised Yahweh and his people Israel. While Hezekiah was questioning the priests and Levites about the heaps, Azariah, the chief priest of the family of Zadok, replied as follows. Since they began bringing the contributions to the temple of Yahweh, he said, "We have had enough to eat and quantities left over, for Yahweh has blessed his people. This mass of stuff is left." Hezekiah then ordered them to have storerooms prepared in the temple of Yahweh, and, when they had got them ready, they conscientiously brought in the contributions, tithes and consecrated gifts. Conaniah the Levite was put in charge of them, with Shimei his brother as his assistant, and with Jehiel, Azaziah, Nahath, Asahel, Jeremith, Jozabad, Eliel, Ismachiah, Mahath, and Benaiah as overseers under Conaniah and his brother Shimei, by order of King Hezekiah and of Azariah, the chief of the temple of God. Korah son of Jimnah the Levite, keeper of the eastern gate, was made responsible for the voluntary offerings to God and for providing the portion set aside for Yahweh and the most holy gifts. Supporting him loyally in the priestly towns were Eden, Miniamin, Jeshua, Shemaiah, Amariah, and Shechaniah, who made the distributions to their brothers in their various orders, whether high or low, irrespective of their official genealogy, to the males of 30 years and upwards, to each one who attended the temple of Yahweh to fulfill his daily obligations, for the performance of their duties appropriate to their orders, the priests being registered according to family and the Levites of 20 years and upwards according to their duties within their orders. And the official genealogy included all their household, their wives, their sons and their daughters, throughout the community, since these men were obliged to keep sanctifying themselves anew. The Aaronite priests who lived on the pasture lands belonging to their towns had men named in every town to distribute portions to every male among the priests and to everyone included in the official genealogy of the Levites. Hezekiah did this throughout all Judah. He did what Yahweh his God regards as good and right and loyal. Everything that he undertook, whether in the service of the temple of God or in connection with the law or the commandments, he did in absolute devotion to his God, and so succeeded. Second Chronicles, chapter 32. After these loyal actions, Sennacherib king of Assyria advanced and invaded Judah, and laid siege to the fortified towns, intending to demolish them. Hezekiah, realizing that Sennacherib's advance was the preliminary to an attack on Jerusalem, consulted his officers and warriors about sealing off the waters of the springs outside the city, and they supported him. So a large number of people were called out to block all the springs and cut off the watercourse flowing through the country. "Why," they said, "should the kings of Assyria find plenty of water when they arrive?" Acting with determination, he also repaired all the damaged parts of the wall, built towers on it, constructed a second wall on the outer side, strengthened the millow of the city of David, and made quantities of missiles and shields. He then appointed generals to command the people, summoned them to him in the square by the city gate, and spoke as follows to encourage them: "Be strong and brave. Do not be afraid or tremble when you face the king of Assyria and the whole horde he brings with him, for there are more on our side than on his. He has only human strength, but we have Yahweh our God to help us and fight our battles." The people took heart at the words of Hezekiah king of Judah. Next, Sennacherib king of Assyria, who was then besieging Lachish with all his forces, sent his representatives to Jerusalem, to Hezekiah king of Judah, and all Judah at Jerusalem, with the following message: "Sennacherib king of Assyria says this: What gives you the confidence to remain in the fortress of Jerusalem? Isn't Hezekiah deluding you, only to condemn you to die of famine and thirst, when he says, 'Yahweh our God will save us from the king of Assyria's clutches'? Isn't Hezekiah the very man who has suppressed his high places and altars, and given the order to Judah and to Jerusalem? You must worship before one altar and on that alone offer incense? Don't you know what I and my ancestors have done to all the peoples of the other countries? Have the national gods of those countries had the slightest success in saving their countries from my clutches? Of all the gods of those nations whom my ancestors devoted to destruction, which one has been able to save his people from my clutches? For your God to be able to save you from my clutches? Do not let Hezekiah mislead you. Do not let him delude you like this. Do not believe him, for no God of any nation or kingdom has been able to save his people from me or from my ancestors' clutches. No more will your God be able to save you from my clutches." And his representative said a great deal more, maligning Yahweh God and his servant Hezekiah. He also wrote a letter to insult Yahweh, God of Israel, maligning him as follows: "Just as the national gods of the other countries could not save their peoples from my clutches, so Hezekiah's God cannot save his people from my clutches." They then shouted loudly in the Judean language to the people of Jerusalem on the ramparts to frighten and confuse them, in the hope of capturing the city, maligning the God of Jerusalem as though he were one of the man-made gods of other peoples in the world. Then King Hezekiah and the prophet Isaiah son of Amoz prayed and cried out to heaven about this. And Yahweh sent an angel who destroyed every warrior, commander and officer in the king of Assyria's camp. So he had to retire shamefacedly to his own country, and when he went into the temple of his God, some of his own sons there struck him down with the sword. So Yahweh saved Hezekiah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem from the clutches of Sennacherib king of Assyria and of everyone else, and gave them peace on every side. Many people then brought gifts to Yahweh in Jerusalem and valuable presents to Hezekiah king of Judah. From then on, all the other nations held him in high esteem. About then Hezekiah fell ill and was at the point of death. He prayed to Yahweh, who heard him and granted him a sign. But Hezekiah made no return for the benefit which he had received. He became proud and brought retribution on himself and on Judah and Jerusalem. Then, however, Hezekiah did humble himself in his pride, and so did the inhabitants of Jerusalem, as a result of which, Yahweh's retribution did not overtake them during Hezekiah's lifetime. Hezekiah enjoyed immense riches and honor. He built himself treasuries for gold, silver, precious stones, spices, jewels, and every kind of desirable object, as well as storehouses for his returns of grain, new wine and olive oil, and stalls for all kinds of cattle and pens for the flocks. He also provided himself with donkeys in addition to his immense wealth of flocks and herds, since God had made him immensely wealthy. It was Hezekiah who stopped the upper outlet of the waters of Gin and directed them straight down on the west side of the city of David. Hezekiah succeeded in all that he undertook, although when the envoys were sent to him by the rulers of Babylon to inquire about the extraordinary thing which had taken place in the country, God left him alone to test him and discover what lay in his heart. The rest of the history of Hezekiah, and his deeds of faithful love, are recorded in the vision of the prophet Isaiah son of Amoz, in the book of the kings of Judah and Israel. Then Hezekiah fell asleep with his ancestors, and was buried in the upper section of the tombs of the sons of David. All Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem paid him honors at his death. His son Manasseh succeeded him. 2 Chronicles, chapter 33. Manasseh was 12 years old when he came to the throne, and he reigned for 55 years in Jerusalem. He did what is displeasing to Yahweh, copying the disgusting practices of the nations whom Yahweh had dispossessed for the Israelites. He rebuilt the high places which his father Hezekiah had demolished. He set up altars to Baal and made sacred poles. He worshipped the whole array of heaven and served it. He built altars in the temple of Yahweh, of which Yahweh had said, "My name will be in Jerusalem forever." He built altars to the whole array of heaven in the two courts of the temple of Yahweh. He caused his sons to pass through the fire of sacrifice in the valley of Ben-Hinnom. He practiced soothsaying, divination, and sorcery, and had dealings with mediums and spirit guides. He did very many more things displeasing to Yahweh, thus provoking his anger. He put a sculpted image, an idol which he had made, inside the temple of which God had said to David and his son Solomon, "In this temple and in Jerusalem, the city which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, I shall put my name forever. Nor shall I ever again remove Israel's foot from the soil on which I established your ancestors, on condition that they were careful to observe all I commanded them as laid down in the whole law, the statutes and the ordinances, given through Moses." But Manasseh misled Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem into doing worse things than the nations which Yahweh had destroyed for the Israelites. When Yahweh spoke to Manasseh and his people, they would not listen. Yahweh then brought down on them the generals of the king of Assyria's army, who captured Manasseh with hooks, put him in chains, and took him to Babylon. While in his distress, he placated Yahweh his God by genuinely humbling himself before the God of his ancestors. When he prayed to him, he was moved by his entreaty, heard his supplication, and brought him back to Jerusalem to his kingdom. Manasseh realized then that Yahweh is God. Afterwards, he rebuilt the outer wall of the city of David, to the west of Gin, in the valley, up to the fish gate and round the offal, and made it very much higher. And he stationed military governors in all the fortified towns of Judah. He also removed the foreign gods and the idol from the temple of Yahweh, as well as all the altars which he had built on the mountain of the temple of Yahweh and in Jerusalem, and threw them out of the city. He repaired the altar of Yahweh and offered communion sacrifices and thanksgiving offerings on it, and commanded Judah to serve Yahweh, God of Israel. The people, however, went on sacrificing at the high places, although only to Yahweh their God. The rest of the history of Manasseh, his prayer to his God, and the prophecies of the seers who spoke to him in the name of Yahweh, God of Israel, can be found in the annals of the kings of Israel. His prayer and how God was moved by his entreaty, all his sins, his infidelity, the sites where he built high places and set up sacred poles and idols before humbling himself, are set down in the records of Hosea. Then Manasseh fell asleep with his ancestors and was buried in the garden of his palace. His son Amon succeeded him.
Amon was 22 years old when he came to the throne, and he reigned for 2 years in Jerusalem. He did what is displeasing to Yahweh, as his father Manasseh had done, for Amon sacrificed to all the images which his father Manasseh had made, and served them. He did not humble himself before Yahweh as his father Manasseh had done. On the contrary, Amon willfully added to his guilt. His retinue plotted against him and killed him in his own palace. The people of the country, however, slaughtered all those who had plotted against King Amon and proclaimed his son Josiah as his successor.
Second Chronicles, chapter 34.
Josiah was 8 years old when he came to the throne, and he reigned for 31 years in Jerusalem. He did what is pleasing to Yahweh, and followed the example of his ancestor David, not deviating from it to right or to left. In the 8th year of his reign, when he was still a youth, he began to seek the God of his ancestor David. In the 12th year he began to purge Judah and Jerusalem of the high places, the sacred poles and the sculpted and cast images. He superintended the smashing of the altars of Baal. He broke up the incense altars standing above them. He shattered the sacred poles and the sculpted and cast images and reduced them to powder, scattering the powder on the graves of those who had sacrificed to them. He burned the bones of their priests on their altars, and so purified Judah and Jerusalem. In the towns of Manasseh, Ephraim, and Simeon, as far as Naphtali, and round their open spaces, he smashed the altars and sacred poles, reduced the sculpted images to powder, and broke up all the incense altars throughout the territory of Israel. Then he returned to Jerusalem. In the 18th year of his reign, after purging the country and the temple, he commissioned Shaphan son of Azaliah, Messiah governor of the city, and the herald Joah son of Joahaz, to repair the temple of Yahweh his God. When they came to the high priest Hilkiah, they handed over the money contributed to the temple of God and collected by the Levitical guardians of the threshold from Manasseh and Ephraim, from all the rest of Israel, from all Judah and Benjamin, and from the inhabitants of Jerusalem. They handed it over to the masters of works attached to the temple of Yahweh, and these gave it to the men working on the temple of Yahweh to repair and restore the temple. They gave it to the craftsmen and builders for buying dressed stone and timber for beams, to underpin the buildings which the kings of Judah had allowed to fall into decay. The men were conscientious in doing their work. Their foremen were Jahath and Obadiah, Levites descended from Merari, and Zechariah and Meshullam, descended from Kohath, who supervised. The Levites, all of whom were skilled instrumentalists, were in charge of the carriers and supervised all the workmen at their various jobs, while some of the Levites acted as secretaries, bookkeepers, and gatekeepers. While bringing out the money contributed to the temple of Yahweh, the priest Hilkiah found the book of the law of Yahweh given through Moses. Hilkiah then said to Shaphan the secretary, "I have found the book of the law in the temple of Yahweh." And Hilkiah gave the book to Shaphan. Shaphan took the book to the king, reporting furthermore to him as follows: "Your servants have done everything entrusted to them. They have melted down the silver which was in the temple of Yahweh and have handed it over to the supervisors and the masters of works." Shaphan the secretary also informed the king, "The priest Hilkiah has given me a book." And Shaphan read extracts from it in the king's presence. On hearing the words of the law, the king tore his clothes. Then the king gave the following order to Hilkiah, Ahikam son of Shaphan, Abdon son of Micah, Shaphan the secretary, and Asaiah the king's minister, "Go and consult Yahweh on behalf of me and of those left in Israel and Judah about the words of the book that has been discovered. For Yahweh's furious wrath has been pouring down on us because our ancestors did not obey the word of Yahweh by doing what this book says they ought to have done." Hilkiah and those whom the king had designated went to the prophetess Huldah, wife of Shallum, son of Tokath, son of Hazra, the keeper of the wardrobe. She lived in Jerusalem in the new town. They spoke to her about this, and she replied, "Yahweh, God of Israel, says this, to the man who sent you to me reply. Yahweh says this, I am going to bring disaster on this place and the people who live in it, all the curses set down in the book read in the king of Judah's presence, because they have abandoned me and burnt incense to other gods, so as to provoke my anger by their every action. My wrath is about to be poured down on this place, and nothing can stop it. As for the king of Judah who sent you to consult Yahweh, say this to him, Yahweh, God of Israel, says this, the words you have heard. But since your heart has been touched and you have humbled yourself before God on hearing what he has decreed against this place and the people who live in it, have torn your clothes and wept before me, I too have heard Yahweh says this. Look, when I gather you to your ancestors, you will be gathered into your grave in peace. You will not live to see the great disaster that I am going to bring on this place and on the people who live in it. They took this answer to the king. The king then had all the elders of Judah and of Jerusalem summoned, and the king went up to the temple of Yahweh, with all the men of Judah and all the inhabitants of Jerusalem, priests, Levites and all the people, high and low. In their hearing he read out the entire contents of the book of the covenant discovered in the temple of Yahweh. The king then, standing on the dais, bound himself by the covenant before Yahweh, to follow Yahweh, to keep his commandments, decrees and laws with all his heart and soul, and to carry out the terms of the covenant as written in this book. He made all those present in Jerusalem and Benjamin pledge their allegiance to it. The citizens of Jerusalem took action in keeping with the covenant of God, the God of their ancestors, while Josiah removed all the abominations throughout the territories belonging to the Israelites and required all inhabitants of Israel to serve Yahweh their God. Throughout his lifetime they did not deviate from following Yahweh, God of their ancestors. Second Chronicles, chapter 35. Josiah then celebrated a Passover to Yahweh in Jerusalem. The Passover victims were slaughtered on the 14th day of the first month. He assigned the priests to their posts, encouraging them to do their duty in the temple of Yahweh. Then he said to the Levites, who had understanding for all Israel and were consecrated to Yahweh, put the sacred ark in the temple built by Solomon son of David, king of Israel. You need not carry it about on your shoulders any more. Now serve Yahweh your God and Israel his people. Prepare yourselves by families according to your orders, as laid down in the decree of David king of Israel and that of Solomon his son, and take up positions in the sanctuary corresponding to the family divisions of your brothers the laity, so that there are Levites for each family division. Slaughter the Passover. Sanctify yourselves and prepare it so that your brothers can observe it in the way the word of Yahweh through Moses requires. For the laity Josiah provided small livestock, that is, lambs and young goats, everything for the Passover offerings for all who attended, to the number of 30,000, as well as 3,000 bullocks. These were from the king's own possessions. His officials also made voluntary contributions for the people, the priests and the Levites, and Hilkiah, Zechariah, and Jehiel, the chiefs of the temple of God, gave 2,600 lambs and 300 bullocks to the priests for the Passover offerings. While Conaniah, Shemaiah, Nethanel his brother, Hashabiah, Jeiel and Jozabad, the head Levites, provided 5,000 lambs and 500 bullocks as Passover offerings for the Levites. So the service was arranged. The priests stood in their places and the Levites in their orders as the king had commanded. Then they slaughtered the Passover victims, and while the priests sprinkled the blood as they received it from the Levites, the latter did the skinning. Next they put the burnt offering aside for presentation to the family divisions of the laity, so that they could offer it to Yahweh in the way prescribed in the book of Moses. They did the same with the bullocks. They roasted the Passover victim over an open fire in accordance with the regulation and boiled the consecrated offerings in pots, kettles, and pans, which they then distributed to all the laity as quickly as they could. Afterwards they provided for themselves and the priests, since the Aaronite priests were kept busy till nightfall making the burnt offerings and offering the fat. That was why the Levites prepared the Passover for themselves and for the Aaronite priests. The Asaphite singers were at their places, in accordance with the command of David and Asaph, Heman and Jeduthun the king's seer. So were the gatekeepers at each gate. Because they could not leave their duties, their brothers the Levites prepared the Passover for them. So the whole service of Yahweh was arranged that day to celebrate the Passover and to bring burnt offerings on the altar of Yahweh, in accordance with King Josiah's command.
On that occasion the Israelites who were present celebrated the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread for 7 days. No Passover like this one had ever been celebrated in Israel since the days of the prophet Samuel, nor had any of the kings of Israel ever celebrated a Passover like the one celebrated by Josiah, the priests, the Levites, all Judah and Israel who were present, and the inhabitants of Jerusalem. This Passover was celebrated in the 18th year of Josiah's reign. After all this, when Josiah had provided for the temple, Necho king of Egypt advanced to give battle at Carchemish on the Euphrates, and Josiah went to intercept him. Necho, however, sent him messengers to say, "Why be concerned about me, king of Judah? I have not come today to attack you. My quarrel is with another dynasty. God has commanded me to move quickly, so keep well clear of the God who is with me." But Josiah was not to be deflected from his determination to fight him, and would not listen to Necho's words, which came from the mouth of God. He gave battle in the plain of Megiddo. The archers shot King Josiah. The king then said to his retainers, "Take me away. I am badly wounded." So his retainers lifted him out of his own chariot, transferred him to one which he had in reserve, and brought him to Jerusalem, where he died and was buried in the tombs of his ancestors. All Judah and Jerusalem held mourning for Josiah. Jeremiah composed a lament for Josiah, and all the male and female singers to this day lament Josiah in their dirges. They have made it a rule in Israel. They are recorded in the Lamentations. The rest of the history of Josiah, his deeds of faithful love conforming to what is prescribed in the law of Yahweh, his history from first to last, are recorded in the book of the kings of Israel and Judah. Second Chronicles, chapter 36. The people of the land then took Jehoahaz son of Josiah and proclaimed him king of Jerusalem in succession to his father. Jehoahaz was 23 years old when he came to the throne, and he reigned for 3 months in Jerusalem. The king of Egypt deposed him in Jerusalem and imposed a levy of 100 talents of silver and 1 talent of gold on the country. The king of Egypt then made his brother Eliakim king of Judah and Jerusalem, and changed his name to Jehoiakim. Carrying off his brother Jehoahaz, Necho took him to Egypt. Jehoiakim was 25 years old when he came to the throne, and he reigned for 11 years in Jerusalem. He did what is displeasing to Yahweh his God. Nebuchadnezzar king of Babylon attacked him, loaded him with chains, and took him to Babylon. To Babylon Nebuchadnezzar also took some of the objects belonging to the temple of Yahweh and put them in his palace in Babylon. The rest of the history of Jehoiakim, the shameful things that he did and what happened to him in consequence, these are recorded in the book of the kings of Israel and Judah. His son Jehoiakim succeeded him. Jehoiakim was 18 years old when he came to the throne, and he reigned for 3 months and 10 days in Jerusalem. He did what is displeasing to Yahweh. At the turn of the year, King Nebuchadnezzar sent for him and had him taken to Babylon, with the valuables belonging to the temple of Yahweh, and made his brother Zedekiah king of Judah and Jerusalem. Zedekiah was 21 years old when he came to the throne, and he reigned for 11 years in Jerusalem. He did what is displeasing to Yahweh his God. He did not listen humbly to the prophet Jeremiah who spoke for Yahweh. Furthermore, he rebelled against King Nebuchadnezzar who had made him swear allegiance to him by God. He became stubborn, and obstinately refused to return to Yahweh, God of Israel. Furthermore, all the leaders of Judah, the priests and the people too, added infidelity to infidelity, copying all the shameful practices of the nations and defiling the temple of Yahweh which he himself had consecrated in Jerusalem. Yahweh, God of their ancestors, continuously sent them word through his messengers because he felt sorry for his people and his dwelling. But they ridiculed the messengers of God, they despised his words, they laughed at his prophets, until Yahweh's wrath with his people became so fierce that there was no further remedy. So against them he summoned the king of the Chaldeans, and he put their young men to the sword within the very building of their temple, not sparing young man or girl, or the old and infirm. He put them all at his mercy. All the things belonging to the temple of God, whether large or small, the treasures of the temple of Yahweh, the treasures of the king and his officials, everything he took to Babylon.
He burned down the temple of God, demolished the walls of Jerusalem, burned all its palaces to the ground and destroyed everything of value in it. And those who had escaped the sword he deported to Babylon, where they were enslaved by him and his descendants until the rise of the kingdom of Persia, to fulfill Yahweh's prophecy through Jeremiah. Until the country has paid off its Sabbaths, it will lie fallow for all the days of its desolation, until the 70 years are complete. In the first year of Cyrus king of Persia, to fulfill the word of Yahweh through Jeremiah, Yahweh roused the spirit of Cyrus king of Persia to issue a proclamation and to have it publicly displayed throughout his kingdom. Cyrus king of Persia says this, Yahweh, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth and has appointed me to build him a temple in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever there is among you of all his people, may his God be with him. Let him go up,